Good morning. We're just going to wait for about sort of 5 more minutes for all the attendees to come in, and then we'll start the conference, The Digital World, Shaping Global Standards for Artificial Intelligence. So just wait a few more minutes for people to come in. Good morning. We still have speakers coming in, so we'll just wait a bit longer for everyone to log on. Thank you for your patience. We still have attendees coming in, so we'll wait a little bit longer before we start the conference. Thank you for logging in to the Digital World, Shaping Global Standards for Artificial Intelligence. We'll be starting the conference very soon. Good morning. Welcome to the BSI conference, The Digital World, Shaping Global Standards for Artificial Intelligence. Next slide, please. I am Tim McGar from BSI, the UK's national standards body. I'll be chairing the event this morning. This conference is the latest in a series of webinars that BSI have done in artificial intelligence over at least 3 years. And for those who are interested, all the recordings from the previous events are available on the BSI website. For those of you who are also interested, this afternoon we are going to be running a cybersecurity webinar as well. And like the topics this morning, it's going to cover the revised management system standard for cybersecurity. If you're interested in attending that, please go into the same link that you followed to get onto this webinar. As many of us know, artificial intelligence is moving at a huge pace, and it's a very exciting topic. Today, we're going to hear a lot about a number of subjects. Firstly, we're going to hear about the forthcoming Artificial Intelligence Management System Standard, ISO/IEC 42001. This is something we've been talking about across these conferences for the last 3 years. And this is really something that's going to raise the bar for how organizations approach artificial intelligence and hopefully deal with some of the key governance challenges we're all well aware of. As with all our standards, whether they're national, European or international, there is the opportunity to actually feed your comments in no matter where in the world you are. And the standard is now at stage nearly where you can actually feed in your own views. So you'll be able to go onto, for example, if you're in the UK, go onto the BSI website, go through the standard and get your perspective included. Secondly, today, we'll hear more about the Artificial Intelligence Standards Hub, which BSI has been working on in partnership with the UK government, the Alan Turing Institute, and the National Physical Laboratory. The AI Hub will bring together all the relevant standards around artificial intelligence, also pointing to key areas of policy and regulation, and bring in some debates and discussions around key topics, particularly around trustworthiness, and we'll hear a lot more about that later on. One other thing that's going to be on the Artificial Intelligence Standards Hub is much more detailed training around metrology, standards, and other topics. In particular, for those that are interested in learning more about standardization relevant to AI, there's a topic looking at how standardization works. And also shortly, we'll have more topics, more e-learning coming through around testing and certification, which, as we'll learn later on, are 2 key topics that people need to be concerned about. Thirdly, we'll hear more about the wider range of international standards activities taking place around artificial intelligence. So standardization for artificial intelligence has been happening internationally for nearly 7 years now. And it's not just the management system that's important. We have interesting standards around the foundational, technical, and around the management of organizations. We're going to hear a lot more about all of those and how they fit together and how they can help your organization to use AI and be trustworthy. Finally, this morning, we'll look forward to the standards and the future of AI and sort of see how standardization may change around AI as well. So we've got a whole series of speakers this morning, and all their biographies are on the BSI website. So if you want to learn more about any of them, please go there. One other thing I failed to mention is before we get to the topic on the AI Standards Hub, if you're interested in seeing it yourself, it's AIstandardshub.org. And if you log in, there's even more details available, and all the content is available for free. Next slide, please. So, as a reminder, this is a listen-only conference that is being recorded. We'd like the day to be as interactive as possible and welcome questions you may have via the Q&A function. To help me and the speakers, please keep your questions as clear and concise as possible. Also, thank you to those who submitted your questions ahead of the conference. As we go through different sessions, we'll include the comments that have been pre-submitted along with live questions as well, so your views will be heard. To pose a question, simply click on the Q&A button on the side panel and post your question. If you experience technical difficulties at any time, please submit your technical issue in the Q&A function and our technical support team will assist you. BSI will be sending a follow-on email after the conference has taken place, the link to the recording and the presentations used today. At the end of the conference, you'll be automatically taken to a feedback survey to complete. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, as I mentioned, I'm Tim McGar from BSI, the UK's national standards body. Many of you will be aware of ISO IEC 42001, the forthcoming management system standard for artificial intelligence. It is anticipated that ISO IEC 42001 becomes integral to organisational success as established management system standards such as ISO 9001 in quality management, ISO 14001 in environmental management, and ISO IEC 27001 in cybersecurity. And you will soon have your opportunity to feed your views into ISO IEC 42001 as the draft standard and get your perspectives included. For this first session this morning, we have three speakers. We have Paul Cotton, who is the convener for Working Group 1 at the ISO IEC International Committee for Artificial Intelligence. We have Marta Janczarski, Technical Diplomat for Microsoft, and Karine Geha, Head of Future Quality and Transformation France for MBDA. All the biographies of our speakers are available on the website should you want to learn more about their great expertise. Paul and Marta, the floor is yours to begin.
Thank you very much. Can you go to the first slide, please? So Marta and I are going to share this presentation. I'm calling in from Vancouver, BC, very early in my morning, and I'm really pleased to be here. So I'm going to start by giving you an introduction on AI standards and on management systems in general. And then Marta will take over and give some more detailed information on 42001. In my role as convener of Working Group 1, that's exactly where we're responsible for ISO IEC 42001. I act as the convener and Marta is the editor for the document. Next slide, please. So SC42 has been active for about 4 years, and we're trying to meet a huge demand for international standards in the area of artificial intelligence. As you know, many people are suspicious of AI, and one of our most important goals is to enable trust within organizations and within their users. And so we want to help build and enable trustworthy AI systems. But equally important, we want to provide a model for accountability. So we've been working on governance, how you approach risk management, and how you approach responsible use of AI. Equally important for many organizations is the issue of conformity assessment and certification. And that is the entree to why many organizations and why ISO and IEC spend so much time developing management system standards. And equally important for the industrial members of our standards organizations is, of course, we want to improve the possibility of market adoption of these kinds of technologies. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of different standards being developed, not only by ISO, IEC, JTC1, SC42, but also by some other SDOs. This is sort of a very simple roadmap of some of the work that's going on in SC42. At the top left-hand side of the slide is a box with foundational standards. And Working Group 1 was responsible for that work, and it was published in 2022. And those project numbers are 22989 and 23053. And they're widely used in all of the other efforts inside SC42 because they define the terminology and concepts. SC42 has also produced a document on the governance implications of the use of AI. That's very much aimed at, I guess, what you would call the board of directors of an organization, so they understand how they go about governing the organization. It's a very process-oriented standard. It was published in 2021. Then we have a risk management spec for artificial intelligence. It's at the very final stage of publication, and I would expect that it would be published certainly very likely before the end of this year. Then in the trustworthiness area, as we mentioned on the first slide, there's a lot of issues about the use of AI, things about bias, how transparent the systems are they explainable? And from a much lower level point of view, if you have a human in the loop for an AI system, how controllable they are. And all of that work is actually done in Working Group 3 in SC42. Now, the AI management system on the second row of boxes is what we're going to talk about today. One of the projects that we've just started in Working Group 1 is entitled on this diagram is Impact Assessment of AI Systems. It turns out that our draft AI management system specification uses that phrase impact assessment about 30 times without a detailed explanation of what it is, although many standards people that have done management systems understand the general term, but we've just started a project 42005 that's going to look into that area. There are other standards as well. There's a whole series of standards on how to ensure data quality, because one of the most popular techniques used in AI today is machine learning, and it's so data centric. We ended up having a 4-part standard, and in fact there's a newer part on governance of this process as well. Then we have several documents on the quality. We have a joint working group with another SC working on testing of AI systems. And yesterday at an SC42 plenary, we approved several new projects. So the last box, the ... means that the list here is growing all the time. Next slide, please. So why do organizations use management system standards? Well, to start out with, there's a couple of major reasons. Certainly, scalability is really important, because the management system standards in ISO are all built on the same template, and that makes them both modular and scalable. So it's actually possible for an organization to choose which management systems, and they integrate really well. And of course, you can have a horizontal management system standard or a sector-specific standard, and they also integrate well. And scalability is really important. You can imagine if you're attending this session and you're talking about AI, and you have also an interest in a management system standard for cybersecurity, another one for privacy, you want to make sure that you actually have a scalable, integratable system. So the level of abstraction in management system standards makes them quite easy to adapt to new technologies and regulations. And of course, as I said, you can have sector-specific standards as well. All management system standards are risk-based because you can't prescribe a value system that a particular organization is going to use. We sometimes use the expression risk appetite. And certainly that's very appropriate because different organizations are going to adopt a technology like AI at different paces. Some more conservative organizations are going to be followers, where other organizations are going to be leaders and are willing to take on a little bit more risk in order to perhaps penetrate a new market or obtain new customers. So the flexibility that management system standards entail, because they are risk-based, makes them adaptable for all of those kinds of organizations. Now, customers and the supply chain are often very familiar with management system standards. And as perhaps the most common one, and in fact, if I drive around in Canada, it's not uncommon for me to see signs that say ISO 9001 certified. And of course, that is one of the earliest management system standards, and it describes a quality process for organizations. Conformity assessment is an essential part of management systems. And they are written in such a way that you can do both conformity assessment and eventually certification. So in summary, management systems provide a strong foundation for a framework of governance, risk, and general compliance requirements across an organization. Next slide, please. So management system standards in general help organizations specify what repeatable steps they're going to be using to achieve their goals. They're designed to be applicable across all economic sectors, various types of organizations, and diverse geographical, cultural, and social conditions. There's an agreed upon structure, and in fact, in order for JGC1 SC42 to be approved to do the management system standard, we had to get prior approval from ISO Technical Management Board. Because management system standards are so important to ISO, there's an extra step in the process to actually get those approved. Next slide, please. So here's a hypothetical example of how an organization would use a management system standard and from a governance point of view. So on the left hand, so the triangle here imagines an organizational structure. And on the left hand side, you'll see there's a reference to 38507. Which is the governance implications of AI, which would guide the organization on how it goes about implementing AI systems in its business. And it also mentions 23894, which is the AI risk management specification. As I mentioned, 38507 is an international standard, and 23894 is in its last stages. So 23894 is what the organization uses to do their risk assessment. And of course, you would likely, for AI systems, be doing that risk assessment at all stages during the development, all the way through to deployment. On the left-hand side, there's a rectangle that's entitled Additional Guidance, Standards, Sector-Specific Requirements, and Control Sets, because it's possible the management system structure is flexible enough that you can pull in other documents and control sets that you might want to use. Marta may describe the fact that the control set that's actually in 42001 is considered optional, and it's possible that an organization may have more specific or different controls that they would use. Within the triangle, you have the usual organizational and operational control processes. You have your implemented management system followed by some organizational policy. That might be an organization has rules on responsible use of AI. And then at the underpinnings of this organizational use of these standards is 42001. On the right-hand side, you can see that there is the process for conformance assessment and certification. We're working on another standard, which was one of the ones the project was approved yesterday at the SC42 meeting. It's going to be called 42006, and it's how you can accredit organizations that are going to actually be doing assessments of AIMS. And then, of course, through this certification and conformance process, you end up, we hope, with the kinds of customer trust that we're trying to build into the system. And at that point, I'd like to pass the presentation over to Marta. Good morning, Marta, and I'll end my video and you can take it from there.
Thank you, Paul. And yeah, perfect. Next slide. So I wanted to pick up where Paul left and just walk through sort of going from the inside of an organization and how ISO IEC 42001 would be used to how it would interact externally for certification and assurance. We've got two options here presented. And so on the left-hand side, it's using AIMS as we use it as a short form for AI Management System Standard in a joint certification model. So this is the management system plus the product conformity assessment. And it's leveraging the traditional certification guidelines that have been used in previous sectors and in previous horizontal deliverables of ISO IEC 17067. So this is both for tangible and intangible products. And this scheme guideline would be then leveraged additionally with the certification body requirements. So we have two, one that's specific to management systems, which is ISO IEC 17021, as well as for products, processes, and services. So that's ISO IEC 17065. And what we've been able to do with the development thus far in AIMS is to be able to encompass both, one through the clauses that are found within the text, and then with the controls that are included to be able to encompass both. And this particular model then enables any additional AI regulatory requirements to be added additionally to the list of controls. And by having this type of joint certification model, we're able to then use AIMS in a horizontal conformity assessment, and it basically enables us to underpin any specific vertical in an industry. So on the right here, we're able to demonstrate the fact that through AIMS's horizontal nature, both in its requirements as well as in its conformity assessment, it gives not only the opportunity for the organization to build trust, but also to demonstrate quality in their approaches and deployment of AI systems, as well as being able to be flexible in adopting it to either sector or specific application-specific standards, such as additional controls and guidance for AI use and biometric identification systems, as well as sector and product-specific requirements and regulations. So whether that's existing regulatory framework in medical devices, automotive, autonomous vehicles, as well as in the financial sector. If I could ask for the next slide, please. So Paul was able to go over the slides that explain what is a management system standard and why it is a specific type of standard that is found within the ISO IEC inventory of standards and products. And by able to use that pre-specified text and format, we're able to have a much better well-versed conversation with other sectors and implementation of specific applications, as there's already a base of recognized structure. So in this particular case, I just wanted to walk through, I had mentioned the difference between the clauses and the controls that are found within AIMS. And so I wanted to give a quick list of what could be found within those clauses. And they include context of the organization, leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation, as well as improvement. And under the current draft, we have two annexes, one which lists the controls, and then a subsequent annex which actually gives guidance for the implementation of those controls. And so some of those controls include policies related to AI, AI management framework, resources for AI, assessing impacts of AI systems, AI system lifecycle, data for AI systems, information for interested parties of AI systems, the use of AI systems, and third-party relationships. So as I had mentioned, this is actually the current draft of these list of controls. This is because the standard is still very much under development. And if we could go to the next slide, I wanted to spend a minute just to explain the process of the development of where we are with this standard. So as Paul had mentioned and Tim previously, AI standards have been under development for quite a few years now. This particular standard was approved as a new project by the end of August 2020. And it really started as a response to drivers of having a familiar control-based approach that an MSS can provide, while addressing the need for governance with this particular technology. And so since that time, it's actually undergone a process of 3 ballots, each with an opportunity for each participating country to submit comments. These comments would include proposed modifications, additions to text, clarifications. There is an opportunity with each ballot to have a consensus-based discussion on what that next draft will look like, how to best describe the controls, which ones to include, how that guidance for implementation is to be described, and so which other standards to reference and leverage. So we've had those 3 iterations, and we're currently in the DIS stage. So DIS, Draft International Standard, and is actually once again about to go under ballot, this time for a 12-week period. This is once again an opportunity to submit comments for proposed modifications, have an opportunity to look at the draft in its current form. We have countries that participate, such as the UK through BSI. There are external organizations that do have a liaison with SC42, and they also are able to look at the draft and be able to express their opinions. Following the conclusion of that ballot, the addressing and discussion of all the comments received, this document will be going to what is called the FDIS stage, so Final Draft International Standard. And then with a period of editorial work, it will proceed towards the publication shortly thereafter. So this is a great opportunity still to be able to join and work on the standard, but also just understanding where it is in its process and the expected delivery. So I have here at a high level what the management system for AI is trying to achieve and what it includes within the document. So it includes the requirements and guidance for establishing, implementing, and maintaining and continually improving an AI management system, management processes to help an organization to develop or use AI systems responsibly in pursuing its objectives, help to meet regulatory requirements, obligations, and expectations of interested parties. It helps to enable trust in the organization and the AI systems it develops or uses. risk-based with controls and guidance to implement organizational and technical measures to mitigate risks, and includes system-level controls, incorporates the need for AI system impact assessments that can feed into organizational risk management processes, and it can be integrated with existing management processes or other management system requirements, and it can be used to underpin conformity assessment. So as we move to the next slide, please, this is really an opportunity for those that are interested, those that are part of the NEAR committees, foreign national bodies that participate in ISO IEC JTC1 SC42. Sorry, if I could just have the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a great opportunity to participate, to be able to get involved, particularly as we enter this sort of somewhat last chapter of processing through draft. You're able to monitor its development and stages of progression actually on the ISO IEC website dedicated to JTC1 SC42. Under standards under development, you'll see it listed. If you click on it, you're able to see not only what stage it's in, what date it entered in, what's its next stage, as well as the sustainable development goals that it aligns with, and more information on that. But if you are interested in becoming involved within your national body, you can definitely reach out through BSI. If you're interested in learning more about the organizations that have liaisons with it externally, of course, there are a lot of interested organizations, both from a regulatory perspective, as well as an industry perspective, that are paying close attention to the development of the standard and looking for direct opportunities to provide comments. So it'll be a very interesting time during this ballot, which is to kick off pretty much at any point in time now for the next 12 weeks, and then really engaging in those discussions to develop the consensus of those comments and that feedback into developing that next draft. So with that, I'd really like to take the opportunity to pass on to our next speaker, Karim, who will give that industry perspective on the development process thus far and its benefits really in participating. Thanks. Oh, Karim, I think you're still on mute.
Right. Yeah, I hope now it's better. Hello, Marta. I'm really pleased today to deliver to you some, I would say, perspective of the industrial interest into AI management system. I will first start with my first part, explaining about my company. So next slide, please. I think it's a bit too far. This slide is the last one. Yeah. After the first one, it's about presenting MBDA. So in MBDA context, no, that's before that I had 3 slides presenting type of business of MBDA. So I will do without the slides then. Just to make you aware about what is the MBDA. It's a missile systems company that is European-wide, and it has been merging missile activities from different countries in Europe, from France to UK to Italy as well, and we have now extended it to Spain and Germany. So it's a multicultural company, and it's a way to understand that the products that are developed within my company are quite complex. And then the market sector we address is complex as well, because we are present in the 4 market sectors, and for all missions and all services for the 4 armed forces. And our values are really important in our company. The first one is about innovation. That could explain why we are so much interested in using AI technologies. The second one is about commitment. We are always committed to deliver to our customers on our promises, and that's very important as a value we behave. The third one is about integrity, and integrity is to be a reliable and trusted partner for our customers, and as well as for our suppliers. And we wish to operate with the highest professional and ethical standards. The fourth one is a passion, because we apply all our energy to focus on our tasks, and recognizing our role in providing critical capabilities to the armed forces. And of course, the last one is the team spirit, because we have a multicultural company, but with a very strong team spirit. It enables us to develop in Europe common products. And so maybe now next slide, it is about the one that was the context. So if you could do it. Oh, that was the third, the slides that I just commented about heritage, the broadness of our company, and the values. If you could skip, please. Yeah, that's the 4 market sectors. I spoke about the values I developed. And the last one is about the context we operate in. We are already a company that is certified already EN 9100, and we also have the certification for 40,100. Already existing, of course, quality assurance practices for complex systems, and considering the products we develop, of course, safety critical applications need to be very much mastered and in the company. And we have a wide range of internal applications of AI technology, from fully embedded AI into automated systems to just supporting the business internally of the company. So there is a strong wish and commitment, I would say, within the company to preserve the high level of trustability in our products. And of course, we need to demonstrate accountability when we will use these technologies. Next, please. So we are very much interested in the AI management system standard because of our business environment, as I just said. And I try maybe to say again some of the arguments that Paul already developed. So next slide, please. So the general is about the fact that we have already a management system certification. So it will enable us to adopt aims from a better perspective as a complementary management system, and not to restart from scratch. And of course, we wish to have it as well to ensure that our supply chain is really believing and trusting the way we operate, as well as we ensure that this supply chain is also conscious of AIMS management standard. So the customer point of view, of course, adopting AIMS is to ensure that we could have more trust from our customers about how we use and monitor the AI technologies. So from a customer point of view, of course, if we operate AIMS certification, it will mean higher trust in our products and in our monitoring of AI technologies. And our customers will also consider that the management system, the AI management system, may help as well, because it creates a common language and it helps a lot to clarify interfaces, what is awaited from a customer point of view. And the organization, from an organizational point of view, AIMS will surely, as I said, makes the implementation easier. So with reduced cost, because we have already some management system certification. And it is important to understand as well that within our company, it will be easier to customize, I would say, the controls of AIMS to our business, as some business areas are already, I would say, legally controlled. Our business is still has got lower controls, but very much more importance in terms of trust and trustability. So we are almost considering as well very specific constraints for our internal work. And the aim is based on the AIMS standard is based on risk, context, and stakeholders, and it will mean as well that once we will implement AIMS within our company, no matter whether the technology is evolving or adapting to regulatory environments, it will still be a good basis to make it progress. So that's also a reason why adopting this AI management system standard is key for MBDA. Next, please. Well, I'm quite sure that interested in AI in Europe means that you are well aware of the European AI Act. And this is a strong sign from EU that they wish to regulate the use of AI within the EU market to ensure that we could keep trust in using AI within Europe. So the AI Act that has been published in draft version last year is setting specific legal constraints on organizations wishing to put AI-based products or services on the EU market. And these constraints are applicable to all businesses, and except military, amazingly, but we are still considering the constraints and the requirements they have set up, and we have analyzed these requirements, the 126 AI Act requirements, and tried to evaluate what type of coverage is offering AIMS towards these requirements. And we have made this analysis. At the end, we concluded that more than 85% of the controls or the requirements that are expressed within the AI Act are covered or should be covered by a proper AIMS controls, I would say, setting within the company. So it's something that demonstrates that the controls that are in AIMS are really those that could make the difference for a company wishing to operate within Europe. So as a conclusion, next slide, please. I wanted to highlight the fact that the AI management system certification will be surely a key component for providing trust and assurance within our company with the type of products and systems that we intend to develop. But it is also providing a very good basis for answering to the EU AI Act requirements. So that's important as well, because the AI Act is supposed to be in force in 2024. That's it. I hope my industrial witness will help you maybe understand a bit more about how AI management system could help. Thank you.
So if all speakers put their cameras on, please. We'll now have the Q&A section. So we've got some great questions that come through, but please keep sending them through. So probably the best one to start with is around, because I suspect many of the attendees won't be as familiar with management systems as we all are. So one question we had in advance was, how should 42001 be efficiently added on to existing management systems, say for example 9001? I think Marta mentioned this as well. So for those less familiar with using management systems, and I mentioned in the introduction, so 14,001 for environmental management, 27,001 for cybersecurity, but also 22301 for business continuity. So if you have one of those in place in your organization, how would you go through the process of adding 42001, and how would that be a simpler process than otherwise? Marta, would you like to go first on that one?
Sure, I can, and I believe Paul would also be able to add to this. I think the fact that we're dealing with the same structure, and so the fact that you have the clauses set up in the same way, and they are required to cover the same amount of breadth from an organizational perspective, means that all that the difference is that additional AI focus within those added controls, right? So the fact that there is a 9001 existing certification means that there is already a process by which evidence and document collection, and in terms of being able to set up the quality within your organization, means that there's already a pre-existing knowledge within that organization who's gone for that certification to then be well prepped and understand the process by which then to embark for that certification for an AI management system standard. So I think in that regard, it eases a little bit of that uncertainty and unknown by having a reassurance of a process that they've gone through. For some organizations, that might have been the first time they went through a type of certification of that kind with ISO 9001. So this gives them a really good understanding and just preparation to then look at that next level of implementing quality through a management system standard for AI. Paul, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, well, first off, I want to emphasize that management system standards for an organization are very process-based. So in effect, if you're implementing one already, you're implementing a series of processes, for instance, continual improvement, all right, that you're taking feedback on what's actually happening and improving the system. You have a reporting mechanism, and you have logs of what you're doing. And so, of course, once you add another management system, it adds to that same set of processes, but in a very topical way. I guess the only possible difficulty that we should forewarn people is you can imagine that there is an intersection point between two management system standards. Imagine cybersecurity requirements for AI. All right, how do you ensure that your data is actually safe? And SC42 is working closely with the SC responsible for security and privacy on a standard for threat modeling for AI systems. So eventually, you know, there are more difficult intersection points, but basically because the MSS, as Marta said, has the same structure and it's process oriented, then all you're doing is adding a delta on top of that existing process.
Carrie, is there anything else you want to bring on that one? So one other thing, which before we go into some of the detailed questions that come through. So again, thinking about if people are less familiar with management systems. I know that Karine and Marta and Paul also touched on this, but in particular, sort of Karine, you mentioned about having existing management systems, how that works through the supply chain with customers. But could you sort of bring it up a slightly level and explain some of the benefits in terms of their internal organization, customers, suppliers, regulation that generally are brought through by using management system standards? Karine, seeing as you mentioned sort of customers and suppliers on your ones, could you sort of talk a bit more broadly on some of the advantages you've seen, say from your mentioning about 9001 or 9100?
Yeah, I think the major advantage of having a management system is clarification of language and interfaces. You know, one of the major difficulties you could have operating some business is when you create interfaces with suppliers or customers. Of course, these interfaces must exist. And in fact, each time when you have to put on a dialogue with another company or with another entity, you need to be very clear on the language you use, because the terminology might be very confusing sometimes, and especially when you want to clarify what the object is you are waited for, sorry. And specifically when you speak about documentation, as an example, you have some, let's say, technical documentation to require to supplier that goes with the product that you want to buy. It helps the fact that the management system is in place in between the two parts. It helps to define really what you are waiting for, and this is crucial when you operate a lot of interfaces, because the more the interfaces are clear, the easier and the better you operate your business.
Kim, could I respond? Yeah, I think the emphasis on terminology picks up on something that I mentioned in my talk, that in effect, before Canada originally proposed the project that became 42001, Working Group 1 was working on two standards, one on terminology concepts and the other one on a machine learning framework. And both of those standards are referenced in AIMS, and they're the basis of what Karine just said. It provides the trio of these documents, as well as the risk management approach, provides a really good foundation for a company like Karine's to talk to its suppliers, or possibly even its users, with a single language. And in fact, 22989 and 23053, the terminology and concepts and machine learning framework, are going to be adopted as European norms. So that's the first step to making sure that not only in Europe and possibly in the UK, but in multiple countries, we're actually all talking the same language. Because of course, Kareen's company may be European focused, but imagine you're a Mercedes-Benz or somebody who is a worldwide company with multiple suppliers, multiple users. They want to have a single language. So that was those projects were started long before AIMS and are the underpinnings of the answer to your question, Tim, because those are the lingua franca that Kareen is saying is so important, as well as having the process-based model of the MSS.
And Marta, what about from a Microsoft perspective? Because I know that you're very enthusiastic about management system standards across the board.
So I think, I mean, Paul really explained it on having a company that works with so many different types of products and looks at different markets within Microsoft. You know, where it's everywhere from laptops to gaming to cloud. Just being able to really have the harmonization amongst the horizontal approaches, it just makes it that much easier to be able to understand the requirements when it looks at customers, when you look at your partners, you know, within markets, within jurisdictions, within different applications. We're looking at AI as being extremely versatile, both as a platform service, not just as an individual product, and that integration, just being able to have a common language, a common reference point, it just makes it possible for that type of integration to exist.
Thank you. So I've got some sort of quite detailed questions on some specific management systems might be worth going through. So the first one is just like ISMS, which is the 27001 Information Security Management System. Would the organization need to have a statement of applicability for controls listed in Annex A? So is the statement of applicability specific to cybersecurity, or is it also included in 42001?
That question was brought up during the previous ballot stage, I believe, Marta, and we worked on it. I think that's an area that the standard could probably do with a little bit of improvement. But statement of applicability is very, very important. The context in which the document is being used is, that's one of the very first clauses that Marta pointed out, the context of the organization. And there are very specific controls. I think some people are really surprised how much detail there is in 22989 about an AI lifecycle. Working Group 1 spent hours and hours and hours hammering out what we think is a fairly good universal AI lifecycle from inception all the way to retirement. And therefore, the statement of applicability has to also be anchored on where you are in that lifecycle. All right. If you're collecting data and you don't even know what the possible uses are going to be versus you're using, say, something like continuous learning where the model is being changed on the fly, then all of the statement of applicability is going to be extremely important that people actually understand that. I personally, I mean, I am the neutral convener, but I watch all of these discussions, and I think that that's an area that might need a little bit of improvement in the document. That's exactly why we're doing this webinar, because we want to incite as much input as possible. In your case, in BSI, I do know there are some Canadians on the webinar. I've already received some emails from them. So this is really, really good that we're getting as many people to ask these questions, and I hope they'll follow up with participating in their national body comments.
I should also say from a from a BSI perspective, when the document's available for comment, we'll be doing a lot of marketing around it to make sure as many people can feed in as possible. Actually, Paul, just one thing you mentioned when you were speaking was about impact assessment, which I think is probably related to that as well, and more work that's been done around it. Is there anything in the meantime that organisations should be thinking about around impact assessment when they're sort of looking at 42001 or putting it in place?
Well, without a doubt, we recognized during the ballot processes that Marta was describing that there was possibly a hole. The 42005, which is the project that I mentioned, AI system impact assessment, is going to provide guidance for organizations on how they can go about doing impact assessment. And we're trying to move that project as quickly as possible because, as Marta pointed out, the AI management system will be published probably in July or August of next year. And we hope to certainly have 42005 at its first ballot stage by that time. I think people have to realize how quickly this field is moving. All right. And in fact, I wanted to point out that when Canada first presented the idea of a management system, there were a large number of national bodies that said, oh, no, it's way too early. And if we hadn't started, Marta's smiling because she was in Canada as part of that process. But if we hadn't started 2 years ago in 2020, we wouldn't be at this point. And the reality is this family of standards, 42001, 42005, 42006, is going to grow, and it's going to require some effort by users and organizations to integrate them as they come on stream. I would love to hear not only feedback on the existing projects, Tim, but are there other pieces in that slide that Marta put up about how you integrate, especially from a conformity assessment point of view? Standards Council of Canada is currently doing a pilot using the management system, and we expect to have some feedback from that as well. This is a very high profile, very important piece of work, and I won't underestimate the amount of work it's going to entail to actually integrate all of these pieces that are going to come online at different times. I don't know, Marta, did you want to add something?
No, I mean, I think the fact that we were able to identify the role of an impact assessment through this development of the standard really gave us, just as the underpinning that terms and concepts gave for the AI management system standard, the management system standard gave the right underpinnings to then be able to have a standalone standard and document for impact assessment, understanding where its use is, what type of information, and how the results of an impact assessment are going to be used to give it that framework for the development of that standard. So being able to have that continuity makes the end products actually already ready for integration, and as Paul mentioned, sort of a family of products to then organization be able to sort of pick up off the shelf and be able to be ready for example, for a regulatory requirement, should that happen, of an impact assessment, for example, and just being very conscientious of the usability of those products to help in any compliance that may come down the road.
So Tim, I need to add one item. I've mentioned 42006, this new project on certification that SC42 approved yesterday. But actually, the interesting thing is they approved skipping actually the first stage, which normally takes 18 months. So we actually have a solid enough document that we're skipping what's normally called the working draft stage and going to 2 ballots simultaneously, one to approve the project and one to get comments. the first round of comments on it. So we're very conscious of the need to push these standards as quickly as possible. And let me tell you, there are a lot of Europeans who see, as Corinne pointed out, the importance of the draft EU Act coming down the pipeline with a very date-centric point of view. So SC42 is trying to be as responsible as possible by putting as many of these parts of the jigsaw puzzle together as quickly as we can.
We've only got about 3 minutes left, and I think that point's worth bringing through as well, because someone also asked about whether the standards become mandatory, because obviously the EU AI Act is going through, but there's work that's going through in Canada, in the US. The UK is taking an approach about where the regulators are focusing on AI regulation rather than a particular law. But I mean, how, just as a last question, how do the three of you envisage that 42001 will fit with regulatory requirements and other requirements beyond what Kareem mentioned around the EU AI Act?
So I think the main goal here for the AI management system is that it's an international standard, right? So the idea here is that it is the common set amongst the international needs, requirements based on those stakeholders that have contributed thus far. And so the idea here isn't for one regulatory framework to fit perfectly with the AI management system standard it is written, right? The idea here is that it has the highest common denominator across the different requirements that evolve. It is in of itself an evolving document and has taken advantage of the fact that there are many drafts already available, and there are many opinion pieces from regulators also available. And so the fact that it is able to take those into consideration in the draft as it is now, and I'm sure with this latest iteration, it'll be even more applicable to the draft that's available in Canada right now, the thought process on risk management within the US, as well as some of the other countries such as Brazil and Singapore. I think the idea here is that if a certification of the AI management standard is a step that gives the biggest, closest amount of compliance to as many of those regulatory frameworks, then it has done its job, right? And so with the process of consideration adopting without modification of AIMS as an EU norm is definitely the next step to look for. And hopefully that process will embark next year. And then it'll be in a prime position for consideration for such a process to be acknowledged by the EU Commission.
I would just emphasize one word. In JTC1, we provide international horizontal standards, and we want to be the underpinnings. There are no outward references permitted in international standards to regulations. The references are in the opposite direction. So it's incumbent on BSI and UK nationals to actually make sure that they put their requirements on the table along with other national bodies. So we end up achieving what Marta's saying, which it may not map exactly to a specific regulatory regime, but it has to map to all regulatory regimes that national bodies present us. And that's, and I don't know whether people realize, but when I convene a working group 1 meeting, I need to get consensus, and consensus is lack of sustained opposition or objection. And it's not easy when obviously, Tim, you just asked the really hard question, you know, like how do various regulatory bodies actually see being able to make use of AIMS? I think Marta described it perfectly, and Corinne's presentation, I was super pleased, Corinne. I've never seen those numbers before, that AIMS set of controls satisfies so much of the draft AI Act. And boy, if we could achieve those goals across multiple different regulatory schemes, that would be a huge amount of success, because as I said, we don't aim at one regulatory regime. It has to be horizontal and satisfy all of the national body goals.
Thank you, Paul. I don't think I could put that any better myself, and I think that's an absolute perfect point to finish on. So thank you, all three of you, Paul, Karine, and Marta. We'll now end this session. We'll have a quick break, and we'll come back at 1:45 to discuss the AI Standards Hub. Thank you very much. Good morning and welcome back to the BSI AI conference. My name is Tim McGar from BSI, I'm the sector lead for digital. The next segment, we're talking about the AI Standards Hub. Earlier on in the introduction, I mentioned quite a bit about it. So we're joined with two people I've been working with quite a lot over the last year. So Stuart Kitney, Head of Department of Data Science at the National Physical Laboratory, and Florian Ostmann, Head of AI Governance and Regulatory Innovation in the Public Policy Programme at the Alan Turing Institute. I'll now hand over to Florian to start the presentation, and Stuart and I will also feed in, and then we'll have a Q&A. So please send through the questions as we're going through. Florian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tim, and good morning, everyone. I will just check that the slides are working. There we go. Yes. So good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this particular session. As Tim mentioned, we will use the session to give an update on the work that we've been doing on the AI Standards Hub. As many of you will already be aware, we've been working on the hub for quite a while, for several months, and we had a big milestone that we reached a couple of weeks ago when we saw the official launch of the AI Standards Hub. And so we'd like to use this opportunity to give you an update on how the work on the AI Standards Hub has evolved, especially around the objectives and the strategy that we have defined for the hub, and then to give you a preview on the activities that will be the focus of the hub over the next 6 months, now that the initiative has officially launched. So let me start with the objectives and the strategy. So the AI Standards Hub is an initiative, as the name suggests, dedicated to the area of AI standardization, especially dedicated to knowledge sharing, community building, and strategic research around AI standardization. The initiative is rooted in the National AI Strategy that the UK government published last year. It is delivered jointly by the Alan Turing Institute, BSI, and the National Physical Laboratory. And we're working very closely with the UK government, both the digital standards team at DCMS and the Office for AI in delivering the initiative. Now, in terms of the high-level mission, what the AI Standards Hub is dedicated to doing is to advance responsible AI, specifically by thinking about the role that standards can play in achieving that aim. And we're thinking here of standards both in terms of their role as a governance tool, making sure that there is adequate governance for AI technologies, but also the role of standards in enabling innovation. We know that through various mechanisms, including participation in working groups, the publication of standards, standards have an important role to play in technology diffusion and knowledge sharing. And so those are all market access as well. Those are all important aspects in which standards can contribute to enabling innovation in addition to serving as a governance tool. Now, that's the high-level mission. The particular focus of the hub within that mission, or one important area of focus of the hub, is to empower stakeholders to become more actively involved in the international AI standardization landscape. So there's an important emphasis on empowering stakeholders to navigate the AI standardization landscape and to become active participants within that. And that includes participation in the development of standards, but also the informed use of published standards. And across that objective, at the core of the hub, also worth mentioning at the outset, there is a strong emphasis on taking a multi-stakeholder approach. So recognizing that all relevant stakeholder groups across industry, within industry that includes large companies, small companies and startups, civil society, academia, regulators, government, all of those stakeholder groups do have an important role to play in shaping standards and then, of course, engaging with published standards. And so the AI Standards Hub's mission is to help all of those groups in becoming more actively involved. Now, when we set out to build the AI Standards Hub, we knew that there was a need, there was a case for doing this kind of work. But what was less clear was more specifically what different stakeholder groups needed, what they perceived to be most valuable in terms of what the hub might do to help them to become more actively involved in AI standardization. And so to find out what the hub should be doing in detail, we embarked on a journey earlier this year, a series of stakeholder engagement events, which involved a combination of roundtables with different stakeholder groups, but also a wider survey of interested parties across the UK to understand what are the challenges that different groups face in making sense of AI standardization as an area, and then in informing the hub's strategy for addressing those challenges. And I'd like to very briefly share some high-level findings from that engagement to give you a sense of how that fed into the strategy and how it is reflected in the pillars that we have defined for the hub's work going forward and in the activities that you'll be seeing in the coming months. So a first finding, which in a sense and in essence confirmed the starting hypothesis for the hub, was that across all stakeholder groups there was a perceived capability gap when it comes to AI standardization. What I mean by that is that on the one hand, there was a shared recognition across all groups of the importance of AI standardization going forward, but at the same time there was a shared sense that current capabilities and levels of experience were falling short for what was needed to successfully engage with that field, to meaningfully contribute to the development of standards and to make use of standards that have been published. So that's the first key finding. There is a shared sense of a capability gap, and that's the confirmation in a sense for the value that the AI Standards Hub can bring to this area. The second key finding was that there was a shared objective across all groups to not only make sense of standards once they are published, but as a priority to become actively involved in shaping standards while they are under development. Again, that was sort of accompanied by a shared sense of, or often a sense of a lack of experience in the development of standards. So strong interest to shape standards, at the same time, uncertainty, insecurity around how to actually do that in practice. And again, that finding very strongly sort of confirmed the mission for the hub that we had set out in terms of really putting an emphasis on increasing stakeholder participation in the development of standards. We then dug a little deeper on what were the specific challenges, what are the concrete obstacles that stakeholders felt prevented them to become more actively involved. And there are four pieces worth highlighting as part of those findings. I'll briefly say a few words about each of them. So the first shared challenge that came out very strongly across all stakeholder groups was a perceived lack of easily accessible information about the AI standards landscape. And that included the sense that it was very difficult often to understand and keep track of what standards exist, what standards are being developed, given the large number of standards development projects for AI that are already underway. But then also, in addition, challenges, once you have a sense of what exists, what is being developed, understanding which standards are relevant to my particular context. Say, if I'm a startup working in AI for healthcare, what are the particular standards that I should be most interested in? A second challenge was around skills that stakeholders felt were needed to be successful in the space. There are two areas of skills that were highlighted and that we will both consider as the hub's work evolves. The first area is around procedural knowledge. So what we mean here is the kind of knowledge needed to understand how standards are being developed, for example, how one might get involved, how to implement a standard in practice, how to get certified for a standard, that kind of procedural knowledge. The second area is substantive expertise. So substantive expertise about best practice for AI. How do I judge whether a given standard, say for bias mitigation in AI, how do I judge whether that is an adequate standard? How does it compare to best practice in that area. So both procedural knowledge and substantive expertise came out as clearly relevant and as areas where many stakeholders felt they would benefit from skills development offerings. A third challenge was around securing organizational buy-in for engagement with standardization. As we all know, engagement with standards development can be resource consuming in terms of time dedicated to participating in working groups, for example, and especially representatives from organizations that didn't have a long history of engaging with standardization, and organizations that are particularly affected by resource constraints, so civil society organizations, for example, or smaller companies, startups. There was a sense that even if an individual within the organization sort of had a sense for the importance of the topic, it was often difficult to convince the organization to dedicate attention and resources to engagement with AI standardization. So questions around how do I convince manage my organization's management to prioritize this topic, to dedicate resources, that was an important area. And then finally, there was a shared sense, again, across all groups, that there was a need for analysis and strategic direction in terms of navigating the landscape. Given the large number of standards development initiatives for AI that are underway, given the regulatory developments underway in different jurisdictions, the fact that some standards are developed at the international level, there'll be increasing number of development efforts at the regional level. Stakeholders felt that there was a need for informed research that provides direction and helps them decide which are the standards projects that are most likely to be influential, standards that are likely to be adopted widely, and therefore to help them make decisions about where to invest their limited resources in terms of which working group to join, for example, which standard to keep track of, and so on and so forth. So that sums up the findings, the work we did in a sense to inform the strategy. And I'll now move on to briefly tell you or give you a summary of what that strategy that we then developed as a result of that looks like in a nutshell. I should start by saying that a lot of the work behind the scenes over the last few months has gone into developing a bespoke, brand new online platform for the AI Standards Hub. Some of you may already have seen this. The URL is AIstandardshub.org. And we, of course, hope that many of you, if you haven't seen the website yet, will take a look at the website after this event, including signing up for a user account. There are a lot of benefits to signing up for an account that we might come into more detail later on. There are lots of interactive features on the website that we're particularly excited about. And in order to use those features, you will need a user account, but setting up a user account is fast, it's free. So very much hope that won't be won't stand in the way for you to actively engage with the website. Now, there is the website, but the hub, of course, is more than the website. There'll be research, there'll be in-person activities, live events. And so what I'll say now in terms of the 4 pillars that we've defined for the hub strategy, those are the core of the strategy, as it were. Those pillars are reflected on the website, but you will also see them reflected in the hub's program of research, in the program of live events that will be forthcoming. So those 4 pillars are, firstly, what we call the observatory. Now that's a pillar that's mainly implemented on the website, and it there takes the form of a couple of different databases. The first one is a database for AI standards, both standards under development and standards that have been published. And then secondly, there is a database for policy documents, so legislative initiatives, pieces of regulatory guidance, for example, in the UK and from around the world, all of that with a focus on AI, of course. And with a view of also over time connecting those 2 databases, so being able to highlight where particular standards have been developed to support pieces of regulation, such as the EU's AI Act, for example, which has already been discussed this morning, and vice versa, sort of where regulation is relevant to different standards. The databases are interactive, and we're particularly excited about some of the interactive features in the AI standards database, where you will be able to follow standards, to receive updates, notifications, for example, when a standard moves from a draft phase to its publication. You can also indicate to the community whether you've been involved in the development of a standard, and thereby enable other community members to reach out to you, for example. There's a discussion thread dedicated to each standard for community members to share their experience with the standard, and so on and so forth. So that's the first pillar, the observatory. The second pillar is dedicated to community and collaboration. On the website, that takes the form of a number, again, of interactive features, including discussion forums, some of which are already set up, which you will see those immediately when you go to the website. There's also an option to form groups on particular topics on the website going forward. And then there'll be a program of in-person activities. The Hub will be organizing workshops, roundtables, webinars. Some events might be virtual, some will be in person, to bring the community together, sometimes with a focus on particular stakeholder groups and considering their particular needs, but often bringing all stakeholder groups together at the table, reflecting the multi-stakeholder nature of standards development, and then enable community members to think about how to coordinate efforts in terms of making sure that their voices are heard in standards development processes, thinking collectively about which gaps might exist in the current standards development landscape for AI, and so on and so forth. The third pillar is dedicated to knowledge and training. It will cover both of the areas of knowledge that I mentioned earlier, so process-related knowledge and substantive knowledge. And it includes a section on the website that will host a growing set of e-learning materials. There is a handful of e-learning modules available already for you to use and take part in right now, and that will grow over time. And then in addition to those online offerings, there'll be in-person training events or virtual live training events to complement that offering. And then finally, there's the pillar of research and analysis, where the Hub will address those strategic questions that I mentioned earlier to help community members make informed decisions about what are the current trends in AI standardization, what are possible gaps, what are priorities, which areas are most deserving of attention. So those are the four pillars. As I mentioned, those are sort of the core in terms of structuring the Hub's strategy. But another important element to the strategy is, of course, the set of organizations that have come together to deliver the Hub. And I'll briefly just mention those organizations and their role, given that not everyone on the call may be familiar with all of them. In a sense, the Hub brings together three key national level institutions in the UK from three angles that are all key to the successful development of AI standards. So the Alan Turing Institute is the National Institute for Data Science and AI, so bringing the AI expertise to the project. BSI, of course, is the national standards body, and the National Physical Laboratory is the National Metrology Institute, adding the measurement angle to the Hub and the Hub's work. And as I mentioned, of course, the Hub is working very closely with DCMS and the Office for Artificial Intelligence in the UK government. Now that sums up and concludes the summary of the Hub's objectives and strategy. And as I mentioned earlier, we'd like to move on now to give you a short preview of the activities that we have planned for the Hub, or that will form the focus of the Hub over the next 6 months. And those activities will be focused on the thematic area of trustworthy AI. So we'll say a bit more about what that will involve. And to set the scene, I we'll briefly start by saying a bit more about the role that thematic areas in general will play for the hub's work going forward. So the starting point is that in addition to the 4 pillars that I just mentioned, there is another element to the hub strategy, which are thematic areas. So there's a strong steer in the engagement it did with stakeholders that in order to make the hub's work more meaningful, more concrete, it should be structured on specific thematic areas rather than thinking about AI standardization in the abstract or in general terms. Now, in the long term, those thematic areas will include a combination of horizontal and vertical thematic areas. What we mean by that, I think it's been mentioned this morning already, what we mean by horizontal thematic area is a thematic area that thinks about issues related to AI and AI standardization that cuts across different sectors, cuts across different use cases. What we mean by a vertical thematic area is work that is dedicated to the use of AI in particular industry sectors, or even more narrowly in particular use cases. So in the long run, the hub's work will consist of a combination of horizontal and vertical work, but the initial focus for the next 6 months will be on trustworthy AI as a horizontal, as a cross-cutting area. In terms of how we define that area, I assume that most participants in the webinar are familiar with debates around trustworthy AI, so I will keep this quite brief and simply highlight the fact that we are adopting a deliberately broad approach in thinking about what trustworthy AI means and entails. So we're thinking of trustworthy AI in the context of the hub as the challenge of ensuring that AI systems are ethical, that they work as expected, and that they are used responsibly. And we know, of course, that none of these 3 factors can be taken for granted necessarily in the context of AI. So there are serious ethical questions, there are issues often around ensuring that systems work as expected, and of course there are important questions and risks when it comes to ensuring a responsible use and adequate human oversight. Reflecting that broad definition of broad approach to trustworthy AI, the hub will consider in equal measure technical as well as non-technical aspects of trustworthy AI, and will of course recognize that there's a wide range of trustworthiness characteristics that play into what it means for AI systems to be trustworthy, including characteristics such as transparency, fairness, reliability, safety, security, and so on. Now, why did we choose this focus initially? Why a focus on a horizontal area and why on trustworthy AI? There were a number of factors contributing to this decision. One important one was, again, the stakeholder engagement that we did in the spring, which reflected a very strong interest as in trustworthy AI on the one hand, and then also in starting with a horizontal approach for the hub's work to, in many ways, build a foundation for making informed progress on vertical areas later on. So stakeholder input was an important factor. The fact that there's a wide range of horizontal AI standardization work underway in different SDOs, some of which we've already heard about this morning. So the fact that that's currently the focus of a lot of the AI-related work in SDOs was another factor. The fact that there are a lot of important policy and regulatory developments that raise horizontal questions. Those were all factors contributing to that decision. I will now pass on to Tim to briefly say a bit more about this one aspect I just mentioned, the fact that horizontal work is very prominent in the current SDO landscape, and then also pass on to Stuart to say a bit more about horizontal trustworthy AI considerations in the metrology context.
Thank you, Florian. So, I mean, just to sort of cover off something Florian mentioned earlier on, so the standards observatory part of the AI Hub covers the work of IEEE, ITU, national standards bodies, that's BSI and all our peers, and also the bodies we work closely with, so CENELEC around European standardization, ETSI, ISO and IEC, who'd already heard quite a lot about. So trustworthiness has been a key theme around AI from very early on. whether that's the work that IEEE did around ethically aligned design for autonomous or intelligent systems, or the really early work that BSI did about 7 years ago around robotic ethics and getting acceptance around big data, which is what people were talking about prior to AI. So much of what's on the ISO IEC around trustworthiness. I won't go into much depth about this because we've already heard about the management system earlier, and there's a great session later on going into more depth, which Milan Patel is going to be leading. It's also worth mentioning around the management system and following on from the conversation earlier. So one of the things we're trying to make sure is improving the trust about that is bringing in lots of the certification bodies into that conversation even earlier than they would normally be happening. But I think from my experience of such management systems, they really do bring trust. So whether that's 9001 in quality management, 14001 in environmental management, 22301 in business continuity, having those systems that cut across an organization really do help to build in trust. I'll now hand over to Stuart to cover the MPL perspective on this as well.
Thank you, Florian and Tim. So for the next slide, thank you, Florian. So the National Physical Laboratory is the National Metrology Institute for the UK, working as part of an international community that is very much looking at trustworthy AI from a machine learning perspective, mainly because, as been explained earlier by Paul, that machine learning is very much a data-driven approach. So metrology or measurement science, in essence, is making sure that measurements are accurate, precise, and reproducible. And this is done through reference back to a primary standard, making sure that you can trace the measurement back and the data that it underpins that measurement back to some underpinning fundamental primary measurement. By thinking in these terms from a metrology perspective, we are able to then work as part of particularly a European community. So on the slide that I'm presenting here, the European Metrology Network for Mathematics and Statistics, which is MathMet, are collectively working together to set a strategic research agenda as to what metrology on understanding of metrology for machine learning should be and what it contributes to trustworthy AI. So the community has highlighted 4 key areas that we should be focusing on, which is uncertainty quantification, generalizability and robustness of models and systems, interpretability, and how the use and access of machine learning algorithms and systems is applicable across many different domains and fields at different levels of understanding. And in underpinning this, a quality framework, particularly around data that is used in machine learning, making sure that it is it can be traced back to original measurement standards or the modality that generated the data, making sure that it's got provenance. These are the 4 key areas that we are focusing on that underpin a metrological approach to trustworthy machine learning. And I will cover the uncertainty quantification aspects in a following slide. So I'll pass back to Florian now.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Stuart. So this sort of hopefully sets the scene and provides some context for how we approach and how we understand trustworthy AI as a horizontal topic in general, and how that will inform the Hub's work over the next few months. Now, the next thing and the last element of our presentation is to say a bit more concretely about specific activities that we are planning, that are in the pipeline, and that we, of course, hope many of you will participate in as those activities evolve over the next 6 months. Now, the key aspect for structuring these activities was, again, a piece of feedback and input we got through our engagement, which was that for the Hub's work to be most valuable, rather than having sort of general thematic discussions around trustworthy AI in very broad terms, the Hub should focus on thinking about particular topics or particular trustworthiness characteristics and sort of pursue deep dives, as it were, on specific trustworthiness characteristics and the role that standards can play in relation to those characteristics. And in many ways, that approach reflects, developments we can see in the standards development context, where early standards development projects were focused sort of on general terminology around trustworthy AI, and now we're increasingly seeing projects that look at particular characteristics. Now, there are three such characteristics, three topics that we have selected, and each of our organizations will take the lead in developing activities in one of those topics. So the Alan Turing Institute will lead a strand of work dedicated to transparency and explainability. BSI will lead on a strand of work dedicated to safety, security, and resilience, and NPL will lead on activities around uncertainty quantification. And in each case, activities will take the form of a combination of live events in the form of webinars, workshops, and other formats. But we will also leverage very heavily, where we can, the online platform that we've developed. So we'll make use of the online discussion forums. We'll, of course, have blog posts and other contributions to share outputs of this work, and to make sure that the findings and insights that are generated, for example, through workshops, are disseminated and made as widely accessible to interested community members as possible. So we'll now again take turn to just briefly say a bit more about each of those topics and sort of how we intend to approach them. Starting with the transparency and explainability. As again, most of you will be aware already, transparency and explainability are key topics in the context of trustworthy AI for two reasons. First of all, transparency and explainability are important considerations, important values in their own right. So transparency and the ability to explain decisions made by AI systems is an important value considered on its own. But in addition, and that's a second consideration, transparency and explainability have an important instrumental role to play in enabling the realization of other principles or other considerations. So for example, in order to mitigate bias, certain forms of explainability, aspects of explainability, transparency will be key, the same for security and safety and so on. So it's an important topic, but it's also a very complex topic, and a topic where standards in particular can make an important contribution in order to enable progress. So some of the aspects why it's a complicated topic include the fact that there is often a lack of agreed terminology around how to describe different aspects of transparency, different forms of explainability. There's also a wide range of different technical approaches for realizing and enabling explainability, and there's a lack of consensus in many cases around the merits and demerits of different technical approaches. There's also an important socio-technical aspect when it comes to the need to translate information to different types of audiences. So the fact that when it comes to making AI systems transparent, the information needs of developers will often be very different to the information needs of consumers, for example. And then lastly, transparency explainability can serve a variety of purposes and aims, and the right approach will often depend on which purpose or aim is at play in a given context. So these are all fairly deep questions that are live questions in research and AI development. And they're all questions where standards can make an important contribution, because standards can play a key role in clarifying terminology, in developing consensus views on the benefits and risks associated with different approaches, developing standardized forms of presenting information to different audiences, and so on and so forth. So we'll look at all these challenges. We'll think about the role that standards can play in addressing them. And of course, as part of that, we'll aim to look at some of the transparency explainability standards already under development, one of them that already has been published, and think about what are their strengths, what's important for standards that are still under development to capture, and try to find ways to then feed those views into the standard development process. I'll hand over to Tim now.
Thank you, Florian. Next slide, please. So BSI, as mentioned, we're going to a deeper dive around resilience, security and safety. So as many of you will be aware, artificial intelligence, like many new technologies, raises new challenges to existing areas. And these three areas are ones that there's a strong pedigree in standardization, and all three are actually interrelated. So in terms of resilience, there's established standardization in risk management and business continuity, which I've mentioned earlier on. And these are helping organizations survive and thrive in inevitable disruptions in a very uncertain time. In terms of security, there's over 30 years of cybersecurity standardization that's been protecting organizations and economies. And the standardization in cybersecurity actually started from the close work that BSI did with the UK government. And if you want to hear more about that, there's also the webinar we have later on around cybersecurity. In terms of safety, product safety standards ensure consumers are safe. Such approaches are particularly relevant to artificial intelligence regulation development in the UK, EU, and elsewhere. So the work we'll be undertaking will determine what the real challenges are. I wanted to share some brief insights into these three topics and the kind of things we've already found out. So in terms of resilience, there's going to be very shortly a new ISO IEC standard on risk management, which was mentioned earlier around AI. There's also lots more work that needs to be done around resilience. So particularly thinking about not just the resilience of organizations, but the resilience of AI. So for example, can a model deal with unexpected data? Is it resilient to being manipulated? And how can we ensure that a model is accurate over time? In terms of security, the global cost of cybercrime is estimated to be $6 trillion in 2021 and growing about 15% per year. And cyber criminals are very innovative and are using AI already. So hence it's critical that the industry uses AI to combat cybercrime. And how can AI best be deployed to protect organizations and protect models, in particular as time goes on and much more of an organization's intellectual property is held within models. In terms of safety, as we mentioned, there's much talk around product safety around AI with incorporated. There's much more work that needs to be done around risk assessment and liability, because AI has really shifted the way that lots of these established sectors work. So in terms of what we're planning to do, over the coming months, we'll be talking about these subjects, and the focus is based on what we'll hear. The majority of the work will be taking place in the background, as Florian mentioned earlier, and then built out to a wider group. So if you've got experience of actively implementing AI and challenges around security, resilience, and safety, we really want to hear from you. And we're taking the findings from the research we're doing and having a wider workshop in January, and then building the results out into a report. I'll now hand over to Stuart to cover the work of MPL.
Thank you, Tim. So as I explained in the previous slide, MPL's role very much is focusing on machine learning and the metrology requirements that underpin the work that we are doing as a metrology community. And we've built and are working through this particular framework to try to really clearly articulate the challenges around uncertainty quantification and how it is applied and understood, particularly in a data-driven approach like machine learning. So we will be working through the hub to provide training and knowledge around uncertainty and how it's quantified and the particular types of uncertainty and what they mean in a machine learning model. So there will be training provided through webinars, through training content, through e-learning modules. Blog posts will also provide a statement of current position in terms of the European Metrology Network and the work we are doing as part of the community, but also wider internationally and the engagement that we are currently building with NIST, our US counterpart. And this framework really works from a base understanding of model biases and how machine learning needs to be generalizable, the random effects of uncertainty and how that propagates through a system, the challenges you face when you've got insufficient data or poor quality data that are using in your data-driven approach, and then building towards something that is principled and has got rules that can be generalized as much as is possible, that allows the metrology requirements for machine learning to be scalable across thematic areas as much as is possible. So I've handed that back to Florian now.
Thank you, Stuart. And this basically concludes our presentation, our slide deck. The only slide left is a brief call to action, well, to share the URL for our new website, AIStandardshub.org. We also have a Twitter account, and we'd really like to invite you all to take a look at the online platform, register for a user account, sign up for our email newsletter to be informed about any of the events and activities that we just mentioned. Yeah, and hopefully see you at many of those events and activities.
Thank you, Florian. Florian and Stuart, if you could briefly turn your cameras on, please. So we've got about 5 minutes before the next session. So anyone online, if you want to send through some questions, that'd be great, please. So I'll also take the chair's prerogative and answer these questions myself. So from your perspective of all the things we've mentioned around the hub, and I think there's a lot in there that we haven't mentioned as well, where do you believe that the users will get the most benefit from? Florian, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I mean, as you say, there's a lot in there, but maybe one thing to highlight, simply because it came out, consistently as the top need and value, also during our engagement, is are the two databases that we built, and especially the standards database, which we put a lot of design thinking into, in terms of how to structure the data, how to tag different standards. So the search functionality that we've developed that allows users to search for key terms and then also filter different types of standards. So, for example, focus on standards that are under development, or only show standards that have been published, focus on particular industries, particular types of standards, particular topics such as bias. I do think that will be a very valuable asset to many users, including the fact that it's possible to follow standards and then receive updates when a standard is published, and also when a standard opens for consultation, such as 42001. Once that draft goes out to consultation, anyone who is following that standard will receive a notification via email once that happens.
Stuart?
Just building on Florian's point, I think the community building and engagement, particularly from an SME perspective, just understanding the standards landscape and how that then feeds into future priorities around research and development, particularly from MPL's perspective, is just understanding the pre-normative research that we are involved in now around particular thematic areas, and just understanding some of the challenges that companies working in those landscapes will face in the future, and whether it's a lack of knowledge or understanding or visibility, and then just how the Standards Hub can help support them. And I think Florian mentioned earlier, the digital health landscape is complex, and many SMEs working in this field that will really benefit from that community engagement within the hub.
I think from my perspective, it's something that's quite simple, but I mentioned it earlier on, is some of the training materials we produce, which are really introducing standardization to an AI audience that might not necessarily know it. I mean, given some of the questions we've had coming in, I think in the audience you have today are probably quite savvy, but for your colleagues, it may be useful to see. So I think just one last question, the time we've got. I think all three of us have mentioned some of the international elements of the AI Standards Hub. But in terms of the audience, I mean, how do you feel it's going to split down in terms of international versus UK? I mean, Florian, do you want to come in on that first?
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll have to see what the end result ends up being, but I think it's worth emphasizing that we are very keen to engage internationally. It's one of the key objectives of the hub. So of course, on the one hand, the hub is meant to provide a home for the UK's AI standardization community, but we also know that for AI standardization efforts to be successful, they need to be aligned with thinking in other jurisdictions, in other countries. And so we're very, very keen to make sure that we explore ways of collaborating with other similar initiatives. One interesting development that we've seen over the last few months is that there are similar initiatives being developed in other jurisdictions, for example, in the US, similar initiatives in Germany, in other countries. So I think for one thing, we'll be very interested to explore how we can partner with some of those similarly positioned initiatives, but then also just more generally engage communities worldwide. Of course, the website is open to anyone around the world, regardless of where they are based, and sort of provides an open source resource in many ways that will hopefully be valuable to many people around the world.
Yeah.
And just to add to that, some of the feedback we received from the AI Standards Hub launch from international collaborators suggested that they're exceptionally interested and would like to engage and look for opportunities to do that. So I think it's really gained attention and maybe replicated elsewhere, but actually is a hub that can work internationally as well as with a UK focus.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stuart. Unfortunately, we're out of time now. So Florian, Stuart, thank you very much for your presentations and time today. So we now move on to our next session. So the next session actually leads on very well from that particular point. The fact that much of the work we'll be talking about today around standardization is primarily internationally focused. And so first thing this morning, we heard about ISO IEC 42001. There's much more work that's been going on for many years, as we mentioned, around artificial intelligence standardization in ISO IEC, and much more to come. So to cover that in much greater depth, I'll now hand over to the chair of the session and the chairman of our Artificial Intelligence Committee, Milan Patel. Milan, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning all. Thank you, Tim, for the introduction. So this session is on standards, but there's also some perspectives that we're going to hear about from some of the other presenters on various activities that are going on from a regulatory perspective, or say the assurance activities from, for example, the UK government. So I think I can control these slides. In the session, we have myself, chair of the BSI Committee on Artificial Intelligence, but also we have Sophia Ignatidou from the ICO, who will be speaking about the certification activities of the ICO and also the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum that's been ongoing for a little while. We also have Nuala Polo from the Center of Data Ethics and Innovation, and Nuala will talk about the AI assurance activities that are ongoing there, but also how standards can support such assurance activities and also provide guidance on operationalization of regulatory principles. And then lastly, we have Henrike Müller from the Financial Conduct Authority as a policy specialist. And Henrike will be updating us on the perspective of financial services and the FCA's emerging approach to artificial intelligence. So I'm going to take a very quick overview of what's going on in standards, both in the UK, but also internationally and regionally as well. So the BSI committee is ART1, which I chair since 2018, which was the inception of the committee. We have over 90 members and still growing. And it's a multi-stakeholder community representation from small and medium enterprises, academia, various different disciplines, large organizations, UK government, regulatory representation as well. So it's quite a multi-stakeholder approach to who are interested in the standardization development that's ongoing. We mirror the international and European standardization activities related to artificial intelligence, and we'll see what's going on from those perspectives in a moment. And within our committee, we have numerous editor roles within the international AI standards development work on various topics, including a published standard already on the governance implications of artificial intelligence, AI quality models, and also we did publish a standard on foundational concepts as well. So on this slide, why are we developing standards for artificial intelligence? Well, primarily it's to help enable trust in organizations, but also to help enable a responsible approach to developing and using trustworthy AI systems, to provide guidance and requirements on how to be more accountable and transparent regarding the usage and the characteristics of AI systems, and to improve overall the market adoption of these technologies as well. As I mentioned, and you've heard previously as well, that there has been a large number of standards being developed, and many of them already published. We have standards that set terminology and concepts around artificial intelligence and machine learning, a soon to be published risk management framework that builds upon the ISO organizational risk management framework of ISO 31000, a series of standards on data quality management, various standards around trustworthiness, including concepts around unwanted bias and how to mitigate unwanted bias, transparency and taxonomies around transparency. There's work going on around controllability, and new work being initiated on human oversight as well. And then, as I mentioned, the governance implications of the use of AI has been published already, and that was jointly done with a subcommittee of JTC1 between ISO and AC on the governance of IT, and effectively provides considerations from a governing body perspective when an organization decides to use artificial intelligence and explores their risk appetite and other considerations as well. There's also new work on testing of AI systems that is that has been also initiated together with another subcommittee of JTC1 on testing. And then, as we heard earlier today, around 42001, the AI management system standard, it being a set of requirements to implement and continue to improve a risk-based set of processes within an organization that help the organization take a responsible approach to using artificial intelligence. It includes the need to take into account organizational risk, but also impacts to stakeholders, and includes numerous controls or technical and organizational measures to address those identified risks and impacts. Many of those controls are not just organizational, but can be applied directly to the AI system, its development and its use as well. One of the key things about 42001 is that it does refer to numerous other standards that are under development as well, in order to help organizations use additional guidance pertaining to the various requirements and controls in the document. And so it kind of is the glue to a lot of work that's going on from a standards development perspective as well. Okay, from an SE42 perspective, it's a subcommittee of JTC1, which is a joint technical committee between ISO and IEC for information technologies. SC42 was established in 2018, and it's already published 15 standards and has 24 additional documents under development as well. There's 35 participating members across the world, and the Secretariat is under the United States and the ANSI standards organization there. And there's numerous working groups that are dealing with various concepts related to artificial intelligence, such as foundational standards, including terminology and concepts, standards around data and data quality, trustworthiness set of standards, use cases and computational approaches. There's also additional work that is jointly with other subcommittees of JTC1 as well. And then from a European perspective, the CEN-SUNELEC Joint Technical Committee 21 has been in effect for about a year and a half, and effectively stemmed from some prior preliminary work within the European standards organizations. Its mandate really is to adopt international standards and also produce standardization deliverables that address the European market. Right now, the main interest stems from standards to support the EU Draft AI Act, and CEN-SUNELEC, and it's received a standardization request from the European Commission asking for the European standards organizations to develop a set of standards that can address and support the requirements of the regulation. The UK's position continues to strongly advocate the adoption of and the alignment with international standards for use within Europe. So I'm going to hand over to Sophia, who will speak on certification standards from the Information Commissioner's Office perspective. Over to you, Sophia.
Thank you, Milan. Let me check if I can actually move the slides. I think I'm supposed to be seeing a mouse next to my name, but wait a second, let me check if this works. Otherwise, I may have to. Here we go. Okay. So yeah, does this work? Sorry, I'm not sure this works actually.
I can control for you if you prefer.
Okay, cool. So thanks, Milan, and thank you, BSI, for inviting me to another conference. So my name is Sophia Ignatidou, and I am the Group Manager for Technology Policy at the ICO, which is the UK's independent data protection regulator. If you can move to the next slide. So this is essentially our mission statement. The ICO is a whole economy regulator, including of government and the public sector. And as part of our technology team, I have been leading on AI policy, representing the ICO at the Global Privacy Assembly's AI Working Group, the DRCF's Algorithmic Processing Project, and the BSI's AI Committee. And yeah, next slide, please. So yeah, the reason the ICO is so active in the AI space is the fact that data, and more specifically personal data, is at the center of our remit. I think that this is kind of like a detail that we keep on kind of like highlighting, that data protection is engaged whenever organizations process personal data, either to train or to deploy a system. And yeah, the graphs you can see are part of our existing guidance on data protection, actually. Next slide, please. So yeah, regulatory coherence and cooperation is one of the government's stated priorities, and the ICO is committed to work domestically and internationally with counterparts to support consistency in the law, maximize certainty for people on what protections they can expect, and for businesses and organizations on what standards are expected. So our ICO 25 strategic plan that was announced back in July also acknowledged how important clarity and certainty for businesses and organizations is. So to ensure clarity for businesses, the ICO's views that any AI-specific standards that will be developed need to remain compatible with existing legislation. We have, like I mentioned before, we have started engaging with the AI committee at the BSI, and we're ready to play a more active role in the development of standards to make data protection compliance alongside other obligations more easy for organizations that are spanning different jurisdictions. And that's actually like a call we get from industry quite a lot recently, the kind of like need for coherence across different jurisdictions, and that's why we think standards is a really important tool in that regard. But also in terms of, apart from the engagement at the BSI with standards development, standards is also a consideration for the ICO in the context of our UK GDPR certification schemes. And if we can, and this on this slide, basically, this is just basically like a top line at a high level stakeholders we have engaged with. So we have fed back to the European Commission on their proposal on AI regulation. We're engaging with G7 data protection authorities on AI policy, among other digital policy areas. And obviously we have responded to consultations by the Council of Europe on the future of AI regulation as well. So next slide, please. So this is basically Article 42 of the UK GDPR, which requires the Commissioner to encourage the establishment of data protection certification mechanisms and data protection seals and marks. So basically, we are required to promote certification. These certification schemes are developed by external organizations, so not us, in partnership with the UK Accreditation Service, UCAS. And UCAS accredited certification bodies then can audit compliance with the standards specified in its scheme. So the ICO's role in this is that we are required to review and approve the data protection criteria of any proposed certification scheme that can be submitted by standards organizations or other bodies. Next slide, please. And this is, again, at a high level, what in general, the certification framework involves, and the different actors involved in that. And UCAS, as you can see, plays a really central role. To this day, we have approved and published the criteria for 3 data protection certification schemes, one on secure reuse and destruction of IT assets, one on age assurance and verification systems, and one certification scheme on age-appropriate design that was based on the ICO's Children's Code. Next slide, please. Again, this is kind of like what are the requirements of standards. You can see that they have to be auditable by specifying clearly defined and measurable objectives. They have to be interoperable with other standards, for example, ICO standards, and scalable for application to different sizes and types of organizations. Any ICO approved certification scheme is announced on our website and would also be taken in consideration in audits in the same way a BSI ICO certification is. That means certifications are considered as evidence of a control and viewed as good practice, but do not replace all ICO's own audit work. That means we will not solely rely on any external accreditation or certification without wanting to seek our own assurances of compliance in the context of, for example, an investigation. And I think in general, we do see a great potential for the creation of certification schemes for specific AI-related processing activities. And I think AI-related certification can play a key role in terms of legal compliance in a world where organizations are procuring systems from third parties rather than building them in-house. And looking ahead, we expect that existing standards and certification bodies will develop certification schemes in response to market needs. So looking at what actually the market wants at this moment in time is, I think, really imperative. And I think we believe certification can assist trustworthy innovation more broadly, so not just AI. And that's why at the recent G7 roundtable the ICO called for the development of industry-led governance and standards to help organizations use privacy-enhancing technologies, for example, more responsibly. Next slide. This is just flagging the work we're doing at the DRCF, the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. This is an initiative we created with the FCA, the CMA, and Ofcom in 2020. And as part of our first year of work, we produced 2 discussion papers, one on algorithmic harms and benefits, and the other on the landscape of AI auditing. And following the publication of the papers, we put out a call for input with some respondents suggesting regulators should work with standardization bodies on the creation of auditing standards. So there is the question around how we can convert regulatory requirements into testable criteria for audits. And in a more normative context as well, some respondents suggested that the DRCF regulators should consider steps to improve standards for transparency. And indeed, transparency is something that we're looking into as part of this year's program. As you can see on the slide, promoting transparency in algorithmic procurement is one of the areas we're looking into. And this is something that we will look to the international standardization development process for input as well. I think I'm going to just stop here. This was just like an overview of the areas we're interested in at the ICO, and I'm going to hand over back to Milan.
Great, thank you so much, Sophia. That's extremely insightful. Next up, I'd like to call on Nuala Polo to talk about the role of standards for AI assurance and governance.
Perfect, thanks Milan. Just waiting to see if I can get control of the slides. It doesn't seem to be working, so Milan, I think I'll ask you to control them for me if that's okay.
I think I've lost, oh, here we go.
Okay, perfect. So thanks so much for having me today. I'm Nuala Polo, and I'm a policy advisor at the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation. And today I'll be speaking about the role of standards for AI assurance and AI governance more widely. And the presentation will highlight kind of 2 key ways in which standards can support AI governance. So first, looking at how standards can support and enable a range of AI assurance techniques. And secondly, looking at how standards can help to operationalize high-level regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. So firstly, looking at standards to enable AI assurance techniques. Next slide, please. Zooming out a little bit to think about, what is the goal of assurance ultimately? So the goal of assurance is really to build justified trust in AI systems. So trying to build confidence in these systems through measuring, evaluating, and communicating whether or not these systems are trustworthy. Next slide. So CDAI has been doing quite a bit of work in this space. And in December 2021, we published our AI assurance roadmap, which laid out 6 key priority areas for developing this assurance ecosystem. And today I'll be focusing on priority area number 3, which is looking at how standards can support AI assurance and AI governance more widely. Next slide, please. So how do assurance and standards ultimately support governance? So AI assurance is really part of this kind of wider system of AI governance and plays a crucial role in monitoring both regulatory compliance as well as compliance with norms and principles of responsible innovation. And I think it can be helpful to kind of break down assurance into 3 key components. So here at the top, we have the authority, who then sets rules or principles and criteria which systems or processes can be checked against using assurance services. Next slide, please. So in the context of technical standards, we have the authority who would be the standards development organization. So for example, ISO or BSI, who sets these rules or principles in terms of consensus-based standards, which are then used to inform or kind of underpin a range of different assurance services, for example, audit, conformity assessment, certification, etc. And the outputs of these assurance services are ultimately what kind of provide the assurance user with the justified trust in the AI system. Next slide. So there's a range of different standards types that can kind of enable or underpin assurance services, and I'll kind of go through a few here. So we have foundational standards, which are around kind of establishing shared definitions. So that could be around concepts like fairness or bias. We have process standards, which are focused on universalizing best practice for organizational management, so risk management, for example. There's measurement standards, which are around kind of defining metrics and methods for measurement. So that could be around kind of how do we measure bias in a system. And then we have performance standards, which are around setting thresholds for acceptability. So for example, what is an acceptable level of bias in a system in order for it to be deployed? And that might change quite drastically across kind of use cases or sectors. And so these are different types of standards that could kind of enable or underpin assurance services. But I think ultimately what's really important here is understanding that these standards really help to set expectations for assurance service providers to ensure coherence and consistency across the providers, so that we kind of have this baseline that we can be confident that each assurance service provider is kind of using the same definitions, measuring the same thing, and doing this in the same way. And without standards, we think this looks a lot more like advice rather than assurance. Next slide, please. This is just a bit of an illustrative example of what this relationship between assurance techniques and standards might look like in adjacent domains. So looking at these different techniques and how they're kind of supported or underpinned by a range of standards. Next slide, please. So that was a little bit of an overview of how standards can support governance in terms of supporting assurance techniques, but we think standards can also help to support AI governance in terms of operationalizing the regulatory principles. Next slide, please. So in July, as many of you will know, the Office for AI published a policy paper on establishing a pro-innovation approach to regulating AI. And this paper set out a series of principles that responsible or trustworthy systems should uphold. Those are listed on the screen here. And I think an important kind of distinction here is that the regulatory principles really outline what needs to be achieved. And we think that standards could be a useful tool in providing how to achieve that in a particular context or sector. Next slide, please. So how are we moving this forward at the CDEI? I think to better understand the relationship or the potential relationship between standards and the regulatory requirements, we need to have a kind of rich understanding of the landscape as it stands today. So we're doing some preliminary mapping work of mapping global standards against the proposed principles, both to identify where standards may sufficiently address AI-related risks, as well as kind of highlighting potential gaps and areas for further standards development. Next slide, please. And this work right now is very nascent, so we're in the kind of preliminary stages, but the finding I really wanted to draw out today was the importance of adopting kind of this layered approach to standards, or a standard stack. So before I spoke about standards in terms of their content, so foundational, measurement, process, etc. But it can also be helpful to kind of look at standards based on their breadth or their scope. So we have horizontal or cross-sector standards, and then we have vertical standards, which are sector-specific. And in order to kind of achieve alignment with the regulatory principles, it's likely that we'll need to kind of promote the adoption of the standard stack, which includes a combination of complementary standards types. So that's likely to be horizontal framework standards, which are around establishing kind of organizational frameworks for effective governance, supplemented by horizontal thematic standards, which are around addressing cross-sectoral themes or risks, such as bias or explainability. And then these are likely to be complemented by vertical or sector-specific standards, which will help to operationalize principles in a particular context. Next slide, please. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the potential role of standards for governance, but I think the two kind of key takeaways here are looking at how standards can enable assurance techniques to ensure consistency and coherence, and can perhaps support the operationalization of the regulatory principles. And we think this would best be done through this kind of layered approach to standards adoption. And I'll hand back to you, Milan. Thanks so much.
Right, thank you very much, Nuala. And thanks for that perspective about especially layering standards to achieve that goal of assurance. Now I'd like to hand over to Henrika from the CMA.
Milan, hi, can you hear me okay?
Very well, thank you. Welcome, Henrika.
Thank you for inviting me. So I'm Henrika Müller. I'm the Financial Conduct Authority's AI Policy Officer. I'll be talking about the work the FCA has done, or is doing rather, on AI, on regulating AI at the moment. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this year, we published 3 documents jointly with the Bank of England on artificial intelligence. The first one is the final report of the AI Public-Private Forum, which was a 15-month-long project hosted by the Bank of England and the FCA, where we invited 22, I think it was 22 AI practitioners from across the economy, so not just financial services. And really what we wanted to do is to understand what the practical challenges actually are for firms when it comes to developing, designing, and deploying and evaluating AI. All the minutes are public, and so is the final report published in February this year. What the report did show very clearly is that there are significant challenges attached to developing and deploying trustworthy AI. And I think the fact that we're having that conversation today actually testifies to the importance of just, how can you develop a system that works for consumers and markets. The final report of the AI Public-Private Forum also demonstrated, and I think we have indirectly touched upon it already in this session, that there is a need for regulatory clarity. I think firms, and as Sophia was mentioning it earlier, firms are asking for certainty in terms of what regulatory expectations actually are when it comes to the use of AI. With that in mind, we recently published an AI discussion paper 3 weeks ago, and the purpose of the discussion paper is to have a structured external debate with key stakeholders on a number of key issues, or rather parts of our regulatory rule book that we think applies to AI, and I'll be discussing that in a minute now. In a minute. The other thing we published today, this year, is a machine learning survey. This is a follow-up to a project we did in 2019. And really the purpose of these surveys is to gain a better empirical understanding of the deployment by firms of this technology in financial markets. I think the one thing I need to say is generally as an observation on the broader broader AI debate is the need for what I think is more empirical data, just to really understand what the challenges are and how the technology is impacting consumers and markets. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Cool, thank you. So this is the AI discussion paper. So as I was saying, the purpose of the DP is to facilitate a broad-based dialogue with external stakeholders. The deadline for response is the 10th of February next year, so quite a generous response period. And then depending on the responses we get, we decide what to do next. What we try to do in the AI discussion paper is to have a relatively balanced discussion of the benefits and the risks. I think it's important to also stress to emphasize the potential benefits associated with AI. And what we also did, and this is all in chapter 4 of the DP, is to set out how the current sector regulatory framework applies to AI in our opinion. And this is what we're seeking views on. An important point here is whether additional clarification is required, or indeed, and this is probably where the standards discussion comes in, whether there are any gaps in the way the use of AI in UK financial markets is regulated. And the overarching question for us really in this entire debate is how the FCA and the Bank of England can best support the safe and responsible use of AI. And if you want to go to the final slide. So this is a summary of the AI discussion paper. So as I was saying earlier, the purpose really is to identify the key parts of our rulebook, so the Bank of England's rulebook and highlight the areas which we think are applicable to the use of AI. As always, we're looking for feedback on that, and I think it's important to stress that it is very, very possible that there are gaps, so that we haven't got everything covered. Again, this is an area where we're looking for external feedback. And the way we structured it is to look at consumer protection. And if you look at the DP, you will see this is briefly discussed. So what we are discussing is the new consumer duty, potential bias and vulnerability, potential bias and discrimination risk, financial exclusion, consent and privacy. And we do make reference to the relevance of data protection, of course, in the UK, as well as equality legislation. We're also setting out how our competition powers can potentially apply to the use of AI, including our market studies. And then under safety and soundness, which is perhaps the chunkiest bit of the DP and draws directly on the final report of the AI public-private forum, which we published earlier in the year. What we did there again is to look at our rulebook and relative to data, model risk management, governance, and operation resilience, we set out what we think the key rules and regulations are. And for me, at least, that is a structure that's running through the entire debate, and that is, and we've touched upon it already in the discussion just now, is the centrality of data, the importance of having a very clear understanding of model risk management, governance, in particular in financial services in the UK, it's the senior managers and certification regime, and also operation resilience. And what I'm having in mind here in particular is outsourcing risk, since so many components of AI, whether that be the software itself, the hardware, or the data, are very often insourced from external providers. And then what we also have, I think you may not be able to see it on this slide, but we do have a question in the discussion paper on whether external stakeholders think that we need to bring in more technical and industry standards into the financial services discussion on AI. And that's it from me, Milan. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Enrique. I'm certainly looking forward to seeing if any gaps in the standards work program are identified to help support the financial conduct or the financial services industry, and of course other industry sectors as well. We have a few minutes left. If possible, I'd like to just touch upon some of the things that were spoken about and ask a few questions if I can. If I can go back to Nuala, that you talked about, standards and even a layered approach to using them in order to underpin assurance, but it can be difficult for various organizations to navigate the standards landscape, being quite complex and with numerous different standards being developed in different organizations as well. How can industry know what standards are useful and relevant to underpin assurance techniques and or to operationalize regulatory principles?
Yeah, thanks, Milan. I think that's a really great question. So CDI has been doing industry engagement around standards for about a year now, trying to speak with industry and understand kind of where are you using standards, where are you not, and when you're not, what are the key barriers? And one of the ones that's come up again and again is, especially with SMEs who don't have a lot of capacity, there's thousands of standards, we have no idea which ones are relevant, and we don't really have the time or the skills to figure that out. And I think there's a few initiatives that are really going to make some headway here. So the first is the Standards Hub, which we heard from in the last session. And I think that's going to be a huge step in just kind of doing that initial step of filtering and having that kind of repository or observatory of AI-related standards. So I think that will, in the first instance, just help people not have to Google kind of like what standards might be relevant to me. And there's loads of different filters on the Standards Hub as well that can kind of help to narrow down by outcome, for example. So I want fairness or explainability standards, what might be helpful. And then we're hoping that the mapping exercise that we're doing at CDI will also help to kind of support that, and that the hub has lots of kind of information about what standards exist, but we're hoping that our output will kind of help to inform how to combine these standards, or what kind of, as I said, layered approach will help to kind of support outcome that you're looking to achieve. So I think, yeah, it's organizations hopefully like us that are trying to do some of those steps and kind of filtering and sorting those standards to help kind of guide people in that landscape.
Great, thanks so much, Neil. I love the connection to the Standards Hub. If I can then turn to Sophia, regarding the work from the DRCF, have there been gaps that have been identified where further standards could be useful to support, for example, the work being done on certification from the ICO, but also the activities of the DRCF, particularly around algorithms and transparency, etc.?
So, yeah, in terms of the work that we're conducting at the DRCF and the piece around transparency, this is ongoing work. Transparency did surface as one of the priority areas in the discussion paper that we published last year that Henrike referenced as well. What we're doing at the moment is we are preparing a series of workshops with developers and procurers of AI systems. But we're focusing on two specific domains, on age assurance and content moderation. And we're trying to figure out what are the best practices in terms of transparency in that regard. So in that context, we're going to expand the research in terms of what tools exist that promote transparency across the AI pipeline. This is one aspect of transparency we're interested in. And also in terms of auditing, I think that that's a focus of the first year. That's a focus of our work this year. This year, we're mostly looking into sharing knowledge among the 4 regulators in terms of how do we actually audit AI systems or AI deployments ourselves, in order to understand what would be a good standard for us internally, and then try to extrapolate and basically interrogate how our thinking relates to international standards development. So that's kind of like a work in progress. But I think, like I mentioned, one aspect of this that's particularly interesting for us is that we are aware that neither of us will be able to audit every AI system that will be deployed in the UK. So we do think there's going to be an external market that will thrive in that regard. But we do believe that regulators have a really important role in actually providing to that third party auditing market the right steers in order to kind of like align their position with what regulators expect. But yeah, a work in progress is the short answer, I would say.
Great, thanks, Sophia. And so there of course is a huge body of work from the perspective of existing standards that support various aspects of technology and its use, and also to help organizations demonstrate accountability and meet their objectives around trustworthiness. But if I can ask Henrike, how can existing financial services risk management standards be made fit for purpose for AI? So is there a need to adapt some existing guidance and good practice to meet the needs of the the requirements around the use of artificial intelligence in financial services.
Thank you, Milan. That is a very good question and not an easy one to answer, which is exactly why we have published a discussion paper recently. I mean, of course, we do have a view on that ourselves, but I think it's important to get feedback, not least because there is a very lively debate in the UK and globally as well. And how do we know what the best approach actually is? I think the one thing I'd say is that financial services have always used data. Okay, they have always used cutting-edge forms of advanced analytics, and AI is just it's just another stage in that long continuum. So it's not necessarily new. So and I think new in terms of it's not new in the sense that you have the expertise within the regulated firms themselves. You have in fact, a very deep pool of expertise within the data scientist teams and advanced analytics teams sitting in the regulated firms. And this is reflected, of course, in our regulatory framework. Now, the challenge then becomes to clearly articulate what's novel with AI, and that comes back to the question of what is it, is there a gap? What is it that we don't have covered yet, I think. I think the key thing is that it's important to have a conversation, I think, but also to have a clear understanding of what we already have and this sort of high level of standards that we are working on, both in terms of regulatory frameworks, but I think also in terms of regulatory authorities who are in this space, setting, at least I hope, some standards.
Great, thanks so much, Henrika. I mean, there's sometimes that perception that artificial intelligence is completely alien and therefore does need special and new treatment, and it's a good reminder to that existing useful bodies of work can be applied to new technologies. So with that, I would like to thank all of you on this session for the informative presentations and discussions that you have provided. And I would like to hand over back to Tim. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Milan. So for our final session of the AI conference this morning, I'd like to introduce our final speaker, which is Phil Dawson, AI Policy Lead at the Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society. He will talk to us about standards and the future of AI. Phil, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be with you. I'm just going to check to see if I have control of my slides, and I do, so that's wonderful. So good morning from Montreal, Canada. This is, if you're outside the UK, this might be the trickiest week to make it on time to your appointments, given that at least in Canada, where I am on Eastern time, we're only 4 hours apart as opposed to 5. So I made it. That's the first point of success. But I'm thrilled to be here again with BSI. There was a fantastic event in May that I joined, and unfortunately couldn't make it for most of today, given the time difference, and also the fact that I now have a 5-week-old newborn son who does not sleep as much as his parents used to. So the topic I have for today, as you'll notice, is a little bit different. Standards in the future of AI. I've actually made it the future of AI standards development. Slight twist, and certainly they go together. I'm looking forward to diving into this with you. So my name is Philip Dawson. I'm the AI Policy Lead at the Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society at the University of Toronto. I'm also the head of AI policy and advisory at Armilla AI, an AI testing and assessment platform that is based in Toronto as well. I'll tell you a little bit more about the Schwartz Reisman Institute in case you're wondering what we're all about. But the SRI, as we're typically known, is a research and solutions hub at U of T focused on AI, and our mission is to integrate research across traditional boundaries and build human-centered solutions that really make a difference. Our chair is Gillian Hadfield, and what drew me to this institute is the focus on regulatory innovation that we need for artificial intelligence. We need to be innovative in how we think about regulation, given the complexity of AI, its unique properties, the speed of development. We have to think a little bit differently about how we're developing laws, regulations, and standards. And so the topic today is really in line with a theme that we're looking at Schwartz-Riesman, and in fact, one we're exploring through commissioned research from the Standards Council of Canada. Currently, we've had some great exchanges with BSI over the summer, and maybe some of you as well, and really appreciated the paper that came out from UCL on the same topic, which I encourage all of you to have a look at if you haven't, but I'm sure you have it on the corner of your desk. Say a little bit about Armilla AI. We help assure model performance, explainability, fairness, and robustness through comprehensive testing. And as much as we try to keep it in line with AI regulations and standards as these emerge, and of course, they're a bit of a moving target, at least on the regulatory side. And on the standard side, many of the standards that relate to our tooling are very much in development or at early stages of development, but we are keeping track of standards at different bodies, and would like to see our testing platform not only as a data science platform to help accelerate time to production for trustworthy AI, but also supplying the compliance tools to data scientists in particular, and risk and compliance teams as a risk management platform. So today, I'd like to talk about the future of AI standards development. And this might be curious for many of you who are standards experts. I'm not a standards expert. I'm somebody who is deeply interested in standards. As a friend of mine has noted, maybe an enthusiastic observer, somebody who's interested in learning more all the time, really from a policy lens, from a regulatory lens, from an industrial policy lens. So you might call me a bit of an outsider, of standards, but not of AI policy. At the previous company I worked at, I participated in developing foundational principles initiatives at the OECD, at the EU with the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI. So I've been following AI policy quite closely, in some cases with a front row seat, or at least participating with colleagues in that regard. And for some of us, from this vantage point, it has looked a little bit like, principles and ethical frameworks and guidelines were really the start of it all. And now we've seen some regulation and a lot of talk about standardization. There's a lot of talk about standardization in the EU, under the AI Act. We just heard from the financial authorities talking about standardization as potentially filling some gaps. There's a new AI and Data Act that is out in Canada, and some conversation about ambiguities or question marks around future compliance and what the role of standards might be, and what those standards will look like. Outside, I would say, of the standards community, this is, I think, how it looks. And this is typically, unless you're in a very large tech company or enterprise that has a mature standards organization, certainly in the startup and tech ecosystem, when you start paying attention, this is what reality, I think, looks like. And then you can see people like myself or my community in the middle, we're starting to realize that AI regulation is quite interesting and really important for us to pay attention to, but AI standards might actually be where the rubber hits the road. So this is, I think, what is a better picture of reality, is that we've had these processes across the top. We have standardization, we could add certification underneath that, but really a lot of these efforts have been ongoing for a while. Folks and experts in the standards community have informed each of these processes. Not to say that there is a very organized and if I may, even sophisticated form of coordination, but there is some. There's certainly cross-pollination, cross-membership in groups, and a lot of the themes that have been taken up by standards bodies at the international level, at the national level, are found in some of these policy initiatives and guidelines initiatives. And I think if you look back at the history, at least in AI, this is a little bit more how it has looked over the last 5-6 years. Again, from an outsider's perspective, I think there's an uptick in attention. I've talked to some people over the summer, I don't mind saying, you know, including Tim, and Tim kind of told me, you know, I don't think there has been so much of an uptick, but I think that's really people in the standards community are looking at this and saying, well, we've always been quite working away quite diligently at this, and that's true. But there's a lot more attention. There's a lot more attention from government, from industry, as we start to think about constructing regulatory frameworks, whether or not to do that, and from industry as well as understanding, you know, the precise obligations, the precise expectations for them, and even, you know, in the granularity that exists in the EU AI Act, you do hear these conversations about uncertainty around the application of the law to particular use cases, and you know, and when and timelines for harmonized standards being published, and what those will look like in different sectors. So everyone is really, I think, paying attention more than ever to the discussion of AI standards. And here's some of the reasons. I won't, you know, they're quite. This is a summary. We've touched on some of them already, but we have the traditional innovation commercialization driver. Companies want to work together. They have uncertainty around best practice, uncertainty around even responsibility, outcomes, and this is really friction to deployment, to collaboration together. We have regulatory frameworks that incentivize conformity, like the EU AI Act. And other regulators wondering about this. We had the rise of an AI assurance market. It was just mentioned in the last session that algorithmic auditing and a market of private auditors who eventually will be accredited or certified to undertake these activities. You know, this is already on the rise. I think from my perspective, the UK is the thought leader in this regard, and certainly with some of the work from the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation and ICO and you know, and the Digital Regulators Forum. There's a lot of excellent work on foreshadowing what this will look like, and of course, standards will be used to inform the development of these practices and enhance legitimacy. And we have civil society and others concerned about relying even more so on standardization for concrete AI governance rules, because of a perception of some of the lack of accessibility of standards development, and of course standards institutes are taking, and bodies are taking steps to continuously improve this. I think there's still some work to do, but that's an issue. Global trade and interoperability, concern about regulatory divergence and solutions around standardization is providing a path forward, as has been the case in other industries, and some geopolitical and foreign policy considerations to different alliances of states and participation in aligning at least or harmonizing approaches to standards development and adoption. So these are what I think are some of the policy drivers that are looking to the standardization ecosystem and standards development for solutions to public policy and regulatory and trade and really democratic problems. So these are the multiple sources of pressure. I think we covered that. Just to highlight them, we have market, regulatory, public legitimacy, competitiveness, and there's pressure from all sides, really. And at the same time, here's just a review, and I know I'm talking to standards experts, but again, the current state of the AI standards ecosystem from the outside, voluntary processes, traditionally industry-led, driven by market priorities, not necessarily broad policy outcomes, but more and more, I would say, with AI, you see that in recognition of the deep multi-stakeholder considerations and the social impacts. There's mixed levels of openness. International coordination is occurring among some standards bodies, and increasingly, I think I've noticed even in the last 6 months from my own home in Canada, and some of the conversations that we've been having at Schwartz Reason as part of developing this paper, we uncover new types of coordination and certainly bilateral cooperation initiatives all the time. So there's a growing desire for more cooperation between states that is happening quite organically. So to me, that's where we are, but where do we want to go? So there's a great, I have the source here, but there's a great guide that has been attached to the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation's AI Assurance Roadmap. It's very useful. I've been sending it to lots of people, again, lots of people who are not as familiar as many of you are with the nature of technical standards, the different types. And I think this really helps give us a sense of where we're at. Two, there's from our research and from just my knowledge of the ecosystem, and I'm curious to hear your responses. There's been initial progress from the beginning on foundational standards and process standards. Some of those have actually been published. Many are underway, quite mature. The AI management system keeps coming up as a key one on the process level. And then we have measurement standards and performance standards, which I think are a little bit medium to longer term plans, and performance standards in my conversations keep coming up as critical instruments to help industry and government really understand the nature of the risk of a particular system, and its robustness over time and performance in different contexts. Whether and how we get to that, I think, is in part what the rest of this presentation is about. But there's a constant evolution towards more granular, if I may, standards that require a little bit more of a scientific method, and a little bit more resource investment outside of standards committees potentially. So that we're looking at the maturation of the technical standards ecosystem for AI. That's important. That's something we want to see progress. I think that's obvious. That's obvious to many of us. How we get there very quickly, maybe less, but that's something we need. A second thing, and this is something we talk about a lot at SRI, and of course for me at Armilla is pretty critical. You'll see why I've highlighted Armilla. It's not just a shameless plug, but I do want to give an example of what I'm talking about. So we're going to need technologies to operationalize technical standards, whether that's risk management and quality management. And you may be aware of companies that are doing this, trying to help automate the compliance process, or even certification, through technology, through platforms that enable cross-functional teams. And again, this is not something that is, I think, too new. We've seen this in cybersecurity and in a couple other sectors, but we need this to progress. We need these companies and technologies to evolve, aligned with standardization. I think that is happening. I think there are ways that the public and private sector can continue to work productively to make that move even faster. We also need AI and ML testing and evaluation tools. We need more comprehensive toolkits. I'm not talking just about the open toolkits that are available, but analytics on top of these that enable companies to parse the results, to assess against various dimensions, performance and accuracy, explainability, robustness, and so on. And that is in development. Okay, and that's something that is where the company I work at, Armilla, is situated. A little bit about Armilla. Okay, this is our testing framework. It's hopefully it's clear enough to you. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but these are the 7 or so dimensions that we test with statistical testing or quantitative assessments. across each of these dimensions. I just want to show you how two of these dimensions relate to different standardization initiatives that are still at early stage. We're tracking them. They're at the technical report stage. But as we follow the evolution of these standards, and some of them are under development, but if you look at the standards themselves, there's really a table of contents with many placeholders. So, you know, as a platform that helps operationalize conformity with standards at scale, let's look at a couple dimensions just very quickly to give you an example. And this is a table I hope will be familiar with some of you. This is a table that was put out in the summer 2021 by, I believe, the Joint Research Commission at the Joint Research Center at the European Commission. This is an excerpt from the table, which is quite a long one, and showcases some of the ISO standards that are relevant to conformity with various requirements for high-risk systems under the EU AI Act. I've just highlighted here standards that are either in whole or in part supported by the Armilla platform today, and all of you are experts, so you don't need to have the actual plain language associated with each of these numbers. You know what they are. I'm not going to give it away, and if you don't know, well, invite you to look them up. That's not true. I'll tell you a few, but you can see from the right to the left, we have risk management, we have the AIM standard, we have some bias and robustness, technical reports at least, and you know, over time, in the fullness of time, it would be the goal of a company like ours to enable or to support adherence and conformity to a larger number of these standards. Today, I won't go through the example, but this is the technical report at ISO on bias and fairness. You can see under where my cursor is, you can see the title of that technical report. These are some of the ways that we're operationalizing content in that technical report, which will find find its way into the standards for I believe it's called treating unwanted bias, or the standard that will follow. And for robustness, again, this is the technical report, and these are some of the ways that we're already meeting the state of the art for robustness testing. And we expect to continue to evolve in line with these standards to help operationalize these at scale. So what I would just highlighted is two things that we need to progress simultaneously, and that is the maturation of these standards developments. Sounds obvious, but we need to increasingly look at ways to even now start to identify gaps or uncover gaps, particularly at the performance level, and that's difficult to do ad hoc. I think it's difficult to do ad hoc or organically in the market, develop content that is susceptible to find its way into performance standards. And we need to, at the same time, encourage this market that was mentioned in the last session that is developing, that will really help supply the tools to manage AI risk and operationalize conformity with standards, and ultimately compliance and interoperability globally at scale. So that's a mouthful, but that's what I think the future of standards development looks like, or at least the goals. How can we accelerate the pace and quality of our efforts? If you've read Gillian Hadfield's article with Jack Clark, Regulatory Markets for AI Safety, this is a phrase that keeps coming up in that paper. I think it's a great one to keep in the back of our minds. We know where we want to go. How can we get there just a little bit faster and meet some of the demands that we've been becoming, at least on the outside, increasingly attuned to? So a typical way is to look at lessons from other industries. Cybersecurity is often talked about. I just encourage you to join. You can see in the chat, there is going to be an event on cybersecurity in a changing world. I'll probably attend that one myself, but cybersecurity industry that is at least a little bit further along, I think, with standards development and some of the technologies that have been developed to support companies as they look to demonstrate compliance. That's good. There's going to be an event at BSI on this topic, and that's great because I'm not going to talk about it today. I just want to mention it because it seems like a pretty big omission, but I also think it's one that folks understand a little bit better. When you hear about a little bit less, which in some ways is also less controversial, is a lot of the regulatory and industry collaboration around unmanned aircraft systems or drones, which was before I got into the AI world, where I spent a lot of time at the UN Aviation Agency, ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization. Okay, so very quickly, some of you who were at the event in May might remember this. I did go through it quite quickly, so I think it's okay to do again. The world of drones, some similarities to AI. First one, and this is from discussions back even 7 years ago that still hold true. There's a risk-based approach. There's a categorization of risk, high, medium, low, okay? And a little different is that commercialization was entirely dependent on the emergence of standards and certification. That's a big difference with AI. AI is already deployed, or at least it can be deployed. I think on the one hand, we do know AI systems are deployed ubiquitously, but for many companies, deployment is actually still quite a struggle. There is a lot of investment, a lot of R&D, a lot of failures in development and production still. And that may be because of the lack of rules, standards, certification. But for drones, at least, standards and certification were completely, commercialization was dependent on standards and certification. There was already a highly evolved regulatory framework. This is a little bit different, but it helps us, I think, gives us an interesting model because it forced policymakers to develop innovative ways of moving faster to get to commercialization in collaboration with industry and other stakeholders. So some of the high-risk drone operations, not super important for us to remember, but just because you've heard of these, I think, in the last 5 to 10 years, but flights over people, flying beyond visual line of sight, so beyond with instruments, beyond what you could just monitor from plain eyesight. These are some of the key types of operations that companies needed to deploy and commercialize. But it was identified that there was a number of standards that were performance standards and process standards that were critical to deployment. The first, a process standard, a management system standard for drone traffic, detect and avoid capabilities. Can a drone detect and avoid an object in flight? The data link between the command center, the control center, and the drone. How secure was it in different adverse conditions? Separation standards for drones flying in a fleet or in a swarm, as it's sometimes called, and remote ID and registration for oversight purposes. These were some of the focus areas or some of the initial kind of critical mass of standards that were needed to get to commercialization. So again, AI were commercialized, or at least we can. With new rules, we'll have some hurdles to get through, but at least in theory, it's possible. Commercialization is already happening. But what are some of the standards that we need to commercialize AI in a responsible way? That's what we're discussing. I really thought it was interesting in the last session to hear about the AI Standards Hub and some of its work and some of the socialization, but also the triaging of priority standards. I think that's really foundational work to identify what is priority in different sectors. Financial services will be involved in doing that too within its jurisdiction. But once we've done that triage, say we've done that, here's what they did with drones. Okay, they developed multi-year, large-scale strategic pilot programs. You know, that's maybe a bit overwhelming for us to consider. We have a little bit of this ongoing already. We have sandboxes underway in the EU, different places across the world. But what this was a joint, very highly coordinated program of work between different countries to tackle different pieces of the drone commercialization issue from a standardization perspective. The purpose was to test performance in priority operations, so those delivery or flight or mapping or different use cases. You could think of what those use cases might be in AI. And part of the purpose of these was to collect data to inform the development of technical standards. So one of the things that's come up in this research we've been doing at Schwartz-Reisman is, at least in Canada, that we've actually had some excellent participation in candidate standards committees. I think Canada, I think it's fair to say, punches above its weight. Some of the people who are responsible for that, I think, are attending today's event, and that's true. But a question that's come up, even from them, has been, how do we get more participation in standards development? How do we bring data from Canadian initiatives, whether they're foreign companies that are operating in Canada or our domestic startup community? How do we get them more involved in standardization? It's a big question, and I'm sure it's being asked in the UK. One possible solution is to tap into existing programs of work. Companies may not be investing in their participation in standards development at the committee level, but they certainly are doing work on AI development and deployment, adopting best practices, and those that are successful are deploying. How can we tap into some of the frameworks that they're utilizing, or at least make build some bridging infrastructure to facilitate that? One way is to build that into pilot programs that strategically do this, and that's what these pilot programs did in the world of drones. Information from these pilot programs were fed into industry standardization efforts and regulators who participated. And as you can see, these were multi-stakeholder initiatives. Each of the pilots included participation from a consortia of regulators, industry, standards bodies, academia, and there was room for public engagement. The result was the emergence of a market of companies developing the technologies to help operationalize standards in practice, to make it real, to translate the legal requirements that led to regulations that reference standards, and then were made real and operational through technology in-house, by different service providers. I think there's a similar goal for artificial intelligence, and every time we hear about the emergence of a market of AI auditing technologies or other, I think this is what we're talking about. I think it's something that the public sector needs to take very seriously. I know that the UK is. I don't know that every government is, but technology is going to be critical to both public and private oversight of AI and assurance. So I want to just concede a few things from my example here. There are some differences between AI and drones. Okay, I've already mentioned this. AI has been commercialized. At the same time, or it can be commercialized. At the same time, I do think that the point of that there are complications to commercialization that stem from a lack of certainty around standardization, responsible AI practices, whatever you want to call it. I think that has been a barrier to broader deployment, broader capitalization, or ROI. And I think that there's a difference here, but some of it is made up by that consideration. Another obvious point, and I hear this all the time when I mention aviation, is that the incentives are very clear in aviation. Reduce fatalities, eliminate fatalities, safety. That's the priority. AI is far more complex. There are the considerations and divergences, or the subjectivity for different stakeholders is quite more complex. But I think that almost increases the onus on us to think more strategically, systematically about how we get to good results. It certainly doesn't do the opposite. At least for me, it doesn't make it simpler, doesn't make it easy, doesn't simplify the process of getting to what good looks like from a standardization perspective, or the development of technologies we need to support standards. And even though it has, I would say it's still been slow in the world of drones, slower than the drone industry has hoped. These procurement and innovation spending programs absolutely move the needle on maturing testing and standardization in the drone community. So how do we ensure standards development keeps pace with demands from AI? Some of the demands we reviewed in earlier slides. So let's think downstream of an AI standards hub, which is a fantastic initiative that is being launched and developed and evolving in the UK. Downstream, and maybe it's part of that effort or another, or if you're from a different jurisdiction, you know, I think there is a role for an AI testing hub that exists through a partnership between standards bodies, academic labs, industry, civil society. I think there is a way, I think we know enough now to develop a program for an AI testing hub to help accelerate our efforts, our standardization efforts in a few domains. And I don't think it's going to be very simple, but I think systematic AI capability testing for priority applications, and those could be determined by something like an AI standards hub or in conjunction with policymakers. But there's a Venn diagram between commercial, regulatory, and societal considerations and standardizations of issues that standardization can help with. If we just begin to look at some of the so-called high-risk applications under the EU AI Act, or some of the areas where policymakers are focusing, even if they're not regulating just yet, in the EU, in the UK, or in the US, you know, some of the same types of use cases keep coming up, and there's opportunity for collaboration on these, and to, as much as possible, while respecting IP and commercial and commercial secrets, to begin looking at this a little bit more systematically, and it is happening, but it's not happening at a large scale. So, you know, part of the program would be to undertake pilots to contextualize assessment, auditing, certification frameworks. So some of the standards, the horizontal standards and process standards in particular, that are already emerging. This is happening in Canada, and with the pilot to develop an accreditation framework for the AIMS standard. I think this is an example of this type of initiative. I think this is the type of work that should continue and have a strategy behind it. And an AI testing hub is something that could help provide this. So outputs of these initiatives would feed into national or international standard and certification development, and that would be one way of tapping into to more great work that is ongoing. It would help catalyze the growth of AI startups that have an opportunity to co-develop their technologies, their assurance technologies with end users, and to exchange with the different stakeholders at the table. It could ultimately help regulatory development. I think of in Canada, there's an AI and Data Act that is a legislative framework for regulations. You know, the regulatory development could be informed by this type of work, and sectorally as well. And there should be, of course, programming to enhance the accessibility and inclusion in standards processes, and just the socialization of these instruments that are, I think, taking on a greater role in society. We only had 10 minutes left, or just under that, so I won't go through this, but these are some of the complementary policy adjustments that are not new for many of you, but I think would help us get there and would help amplify efforts by AI testing hubs. If they spread out across the world, there certainly need to be regulatory coordination or international cooperation, that is already underway. This I would see it as part of these bilateral partnerships that are emerging. Okay, look, there's a little bit more that we could get into. I think I've gone a little bit long, and I'd like to leave room for at least a few questions. And I hope that was some newish content for some of you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Philip. If you could just turn your camera on. So we've got about sort of 6 or 7 minutes for questions. So a couple of things I think would be quite good to cover off. So one thing that's come through, which is it's come through live, it's about the speed of AI development. So I end up having these questions very frequently because I deal with tech subjects. So I'll put it to you rather than have to deal with it myself. So we have this situation where AI is moving rapidly. Standardization moves, at a reasonable pace, but not as fast as the technology. And regulation moves slower. And regulation is a situation, if regulation exists, you have to do it. Standards interpret that and technology moves faster. So in this field and in other fields, how do you ensure that the standardization and the regulation keeps up with technology that's moving into so many different sectors at such a speed? It's a hard question, I know.
Great question. It's a great question. I think that part of whether we're talking about strategic pilot programs or an AI testing hub, I think that's part of the goal, to have in an environment, a trusted environment with that has legitimacy because of the participation of different stakeholders. Have an opportunity for controlled experiments with some of the, if you're at the Schwartz-Riesen Institute, we call these regulatory technologies that help operationalize responsible data and AI use at scale. So I'll give you an example. These are just conversations I have with people to see if there is an interest. There's a lot of interest. No one's doing this yet. But the different AI labs in Canada or different AI startup accelerators, I think there's an opportunity and a need in the market to create a hub, call it a testing hub or a responsible AI accelerator hub, where you have different service providers providing a critical service across the value chain, the data and AI value chain. So we have companies developing AI-enhanced data quality solutions. We have companies that are supplying de-identification or anonymization of data services. We have companies that are testing data sets, testing models. We have companies that are doing real-time monitoring of AI in operations. I think we need to see this full picture somewhere, and we need to have folks who are standardization experts, whether at the companies themselves or at potentially organizations like BSI, Standards Council of Canada. We need to have people who are able to extract the best practices and frameworks that are actually evolving at the technology level, and input these into standards development. And if regulators are aware of this, or I should say policymakers are aware of this, they know what's coming ahead for companies in terms of how they're going to deal with, not just standards, but how they're going to deal with AI governance issues through technologies. That's how they're going to do it in practice, to do it at scale. They can't do it manually, given how the scrutability issues with AI systems, given the scale of deployment. They're going to need technology. So there's a need for some type of location or project or program where the technology is being developed in a broader community, or at least is being simulations are taking place, trials are being run, and a pipeline from the standards bodies to committees at ISO exists, and regulators and policymakers at the table. One of the things that came up, and Tim, I think we talked about this too, but a couple of the people in our Schwartz-Reisman research told us that they see more and more governments at the table as standards community at the standards committees. But I think they also need to be spending more time, or at least the industry or the academic community in a more systematic way can continue to educate governments about the role of technology, the inevitable role of technology in helping to manage some of AI risks.
Yeah, I mean, just as a final point from me, then we'll close off. I mean, for us, it's all about, the same as SCC, it's about bringing together all the relevant stakeholders, and regulators and governments are key stakeholders. Sometimes it's a case of they're not always as involved as we'd like to be, and AI is fantastic that they are. I think that's great for the sector. I just want to finish off there today. That was a fantastic presentation, Philip. Thank you very much for doing that, and the early start for you as well. So I just want to finish off the session for today, and to sort of bring it all to a close. I want to thank all our speakers, so Marta, Karine, Paul, Stuart, Florian, Milan, Nuala, Enrique, and Phil. I also thank my BSI colleagues for putting the event together today. BSI will be sending a follow-up email after the conference, the link to the recording and the presentations used today. So as soon as the conference ends, you will sent automatically to the feedback survey. And I know we've mentioned it before a few times to forget today, but we're doing a webinar on cybersecurity in an hour's time, so please register for that. Thank you very much for your time, and goodbye.